The train whistle cut through the mountain air like a blade, its mournful cry echoing off the granite peaks that surrounded Cedar Ridge Station. Amy Johnson pressed her face to the grimy window, watching the small wooden platform come into view through the swirling snow. Her breath fogged the glass as her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a reminder of the deception that had brought her here. She was not the woman in the photograph. The tintype she had sent to Edward Cox 3 months ago belonged to her sister Margaret, who had died of consumption the previous winter. Amy had found the correspondence among Margaret's belongings, letters filled with promises of a new life in the Colorado Territory, of a man seeking a wife to share his homestead in the mountains. In her desperation, with creditors pounding at her door and winter closing in on her cramped Chicago tenement, Amy had written back as Margaret. Now, as the train shuddered to a halt with a great hiss of steam, she clutched her worn carpetbag and tried to summon courage she did not feel. Through the window, she could see a man standing alone on the platform, tall and lean with dark hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Edward Cox, she presumed, waiting for a bride who would never arrive. Amy was 26 years old, soft around the middle from too many meals of bread and potatoes, her brown hair already showing threads of silver at the temples. Her dress, the best she owned, was nevertheless patched at the elbows and let out twice to accommodate her fuller figure. She bore no resemblance to the slender, fair-haired beauty in Margaret's photograph. The conductor appeared in the aisle, calling out their destination. Other passengers began gathering their belongings, but Amy remained frozen in her seat, watching Edward Cox through the glass. He held a piece of paper in his gloved hands, no doubt the very tintype that had sealed her fate. What had she been thinking? The plan that had seemed so reasonable in the depths of a Chicago winter now revealed itself as the desperate fantasy of a woman with no other options. She would step off this train, and Edward Cox would take one look at her and know immediately that she was not the woman he had been corresponding with. He would demand an explanation she could not give, would likely put her back on the very next train to Chicago, where nothing waited for her but debt and despair. The other passengers filed past her seat, their boots echoing on the wooden floor of the car. Soon she would be alone with her cowardice, and the train would carry her back east to face the consequences of her flight. She had spent the last of her savings on this ticket, had burned every bridge behind her in her haste to escape. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. A sharp rap on the window made her jump. Edward Cox stood just outside, his breath visible in the cold air as he peered into the train car. His eyes found hers through the glass, and she saw them narrow slightly, confusion creasing his brow. He had been expecting someone else, someone who looked nothing like the woman staring back at him with wide, frightened eyes. Amy forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her heavy wool skirt. There was nowhere to run now, nowhere to hide from the reckoning that awaited her on that snow-covered platform. She made her way down the aisle, each step feeling like a march toward her own execution. The conductor helped her down from the train car, and suddenly she was standing face to face with Edward Cox, the mountain wind cutting through her thin coat like ice. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 35, with lines around his gray eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and snow. His face was weathered but not unkind, though at the moment it wore an expression of profound bewilderment. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The train behind them hissed and groaned, preparing for its departure. Other passengers hurried past them toward the small station house, eager to escape the bitter cold. Edward Cox looked down at the tintype in his hands, then back at Amy, then at the photograph again. She watched his face as understanding dawned, saw the exact moment when he realized that the woman before him was not Margaret Johnson, the delicate beauty who had promised to be his wife. His jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "You are not her." It was not a question. Amy felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from relief at finally being discovered or despair at her situation, she could not say. "No," she whispered, "I am not." The train whistle sounded again, urgent now. The conductor was calling for final boarding, his voice carrying across the platform. Edward Cox glanced toward the train, then back at Amy, his expression unreadable. "Where is Margaret Johnson?" The question hung between them like a physical thing. Amy clutched her carpetbag tighter. feeling the weight of her sister's letters inside, all the correspondence that had led to this moment of reckoning. "She is dead," Amy said, the words barely audible above the wind. "She died last winter. I am Amy Johnson, her sister." Edward Cox stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. Behind them, the train gave a final whistle and began to pull away from the station, carrying with it Amy's last chance of escape. The sound of its wheels on the tracks grew fainter as it disappeared around the bend, leaving them alone on the platform, with the snow beginning to fall more heavily. "I see," Edward said finally. "And you came in her place." It was not an accusation, merely a statement of fact, but Amy felt the weight of her deception settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "Yes," she said, "I had nowhere else to go." The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Amy could hear the wind whistling through the eaves of the station house, could feel the snow settling on her shoulders and dampening her hair. Edward Cox continued to study her, his expression impossible to read. She had expected anger, had prepared herself for accusations and demands for explanations. Instead, he simply folded the tintype carefully and placed it in the pocket of his heavy coat. "You have traveled a long way," he said at last. "Are you hungry?" The unexpected kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Amy had not eaten since the previous evening, had been too nervous to take more than a few bites of the stale bread she had brought for the journey. Her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Yes," she admitted, "I am." Edward Cox nodded toward the small building that served as both station house and general store. "Come, we will get you something to eat, and then we will talk." He turned and walked toward the building without waiting to see if she would follow. Amy stood for a moment on the empty platform, watching his retreating figure. She could still hear the faint sound of the train in the distance, growing ever fainter. Soon it would be gone entirely, and with it any chance of returning to the life she had left behind. But what life was that, really? A cramped room in a boarding house, barely large enough for a bed and washstand. Work in a factory that paid barely enough to keep body and soul together. Creditors who grew more insistent with each passing week. The constant fear of ending up on the streets with no family left to turn to and no prospects for anything better. At least here, in this remote mountain town, she had the possibility of something different, even if that possibility had been built on a lie. Amy followed Edward Cox into the station house, her boots crunching in the snow. The building was small and cramped, with a pot-bellied stove in one corner that filled the space with blessed warmth. A few rough wooden tables and chairs were scattered about, and behind a makeshift counter stood a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes. Edward spoke quietly to the woman, who nodded and disappeared through a door behind the counter. He gestured for Amy to take a seat at one of the tables, then settled himself across from her, removing his hat and setting it on the scarred wooden surface between them. In the better light of the station house, Amy could see him more clearly. His hair was dark brown with threads of silver at the temples, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors. His hands, she noticed, were calloused and scarred, the hands of someone accustomed to hard work. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something solid and dependable about him that she found unexpectedly comforting. The woman returned with a plate of bread and cheese, along with a steaming bowl of stew that smelled of beef and vegetables. Amy realized she was ravenous, but she forced herself to eat slowly, mindful of her manners despite her hunger. Edward Cox watched her eat without speaking, his expression thoughtful. When she had finished most of the stew, he finally broke the silence. "Tell me about Margaret." Amy set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone. She had known this moment would come, had rehearsed what she would say during the long train ride west. But now, faced with his direct gaze, the words seemed to stick in her throat. "She was my younger sister," Amy began slowly. "She was beautiful, much more beautiful than I. She had consumption. It took her slowly over the course of several months." Edward nodded, his expression grave. "I am sorry for your loss." The simple kindness of his words brought tears to Amy's eyes. She blinked them back, determined not to break down in front of this stranger who had every right to be angry with her. "She began corresponding with you before she became too ill to write," Amy continued. "When I found her letters after she died, I read about your offer of marriage, about the life you described here in Colorado. I had nothing left in Chicago, no family, no prospects. I thought perhaps I could take her place, and you believed I would not notice the deception. Heat flooded Amy's cheeks. I hope that by the time you realize the truth, you might be willing to give me a chance. I know it was wrong. I know I have no right to ask for your kindness after lying to you, but I was desperate. Edward Cox leaned back in his chair, studying her with those penetrating gray eyes. What skills do you possess, Miss Johnson? Can you cook? Can you keep house? Can you tend a garden? Amy straightened in her chair, surprised by the practical turn of the conversation. Yes, she said. I can do all of those things. I worked in a factory in Chicago, but before that I kept house for my father after our mother died. I know how to preserve food, how to mend clothes, how to tend the sick. I am not afraid of hard work. That is good, Edward said. Life here is not easy. The winters are long and harsh, and the nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. A man needs a partner who can pull her own weight. Amy felt a flicker of hope kindle in her chest. Are you saying you might be willing to consider honoring the arrangement you made with Margaret? Edward was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the frost-covered window. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully measured. I am a practical man, Miss Johnson. I have a homestead that requires 2 people to run properly. I have cattle that need tending and crops that need harvesting. I am not getting any younger, and I cannot do it all alone much longer. He paused, then looked directly at her. I will not pretend that this is what I expected when I placed my advertisement for a wife, but I am not a man who makes decisions based on appearances alone. If you are willing to work, if you are willing to learn the ways of mountain life, then perhaps we can come to an arrangement. Amy felt her heart leap, but she forced herself to remain calm. What sort of arrangement? A practical one, Edward said. You will come to my homestead and keep house for me. You will cook and clean and tend the garden. In return, you will have food and shelter and protection. After a suitable period, if we find we can work well together, we will discuss marriage. It was not a romantic proposal, but Amy had not expected romance. She had come west seeking security and a chance at a better life, and Edward Cox was offering both. How long a period, she asked. Through the winter, Edward replied. Come spring, we will know whether this arrangement suits us both. Amy nodded slowly. It was more than she had dared hope for, more kindness than she deserved after her deception. And what if we find we do not suit? Then I will provide you with passage to wherever you wish to go, and enough money to start fresh. You will not be left destitute. The generosity of his offer took her breath away. She had expected to be sent back to Chicago immediately, had prepared herself for that possibility. Instead, he was offering her a real chance at the life she had dreamed of during those long, cold nights in her Chicago tenement. Why, she asked, why would you be so kind to someone who has deceived you? Edward Cox was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. Because I know what it is to be desperate, he said finally. Because I know what it is to have nowhere else to turn. There was something in his voice, a note of old pain, that made Amy wonder what had brought him to this remote mountain homestead, what had driven him to place an advertisement for a mail-order bride. But she did not ask. They were both carrying secrets, both running from something. I accept your offer, she said. Thank you for your kindness. Edward nodded and stood, reaching for his hat. Then we should go. It is a long ride to the homestead, and the weather is turning worse. Amy gathered her carpet bag and followed him outside, where the snow was now falling steadily. The platform was empty except for a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses, their breath visible in the cold air. Edward helped her up onto the wooden seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the station, Amy looked back at the small building that had been the site of her confession and, unexpectedly, her salvation. The snow was already covering their tracks, erasing all evidence of their presence there. The road wound up into the mountains, following a narrow valley between towering peaks. The snow fell more heavily as they climbed, and Amy pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. Edward noticed her shivering and reached behind the seat to pull out a heavy wool blanket, which he draped around her shoulders without a word. The kindness of the gesture brought fresh tears to her eyes. She had spent so many years fending for herself, had grown so accustomed to hardship and indifference, that simple acts of consideration moved her more than they should have. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the horses' hooves in the snow. The landscape around them was breathtaking in its stark beauty, all white peaks and dark pines and endless sky. Amy had never seen country like this, had never imagined such vastness existed. As the afternoon wore on, the snow began to fall even more heavily, and Amy could see that Edward was growing concerned. He urged the horses to move faster, his jaw set with determination. The wind picked up, driving the snow sideways and making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. "Not much farther," Edward said, raising his voice above the wind. "We should reach the homestead before dark." But even as he spoke, Amy could see the worry in his eyes. The storm was worsening rapidly, and the temperature was dropping. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and tried to project a confidence she did not feel. The wind howled through the valley like a living thing, driving the snow in great sweeping curtains that obscured the road ahead. Amy could no longer feel her feet, despite the heavy wool stockings and sturdy boots she wore. The blanket Edward had given her was crusted with ice, and she could see frost forming on the horses' manes. Edward Cox sat rigid beside her, his hands white-knuckled on the reins as he guided the horses through what had become a complete whiteout. Amy could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as he peered ahead into the swirling snow. "How much farther?" she asked, though she had to raise her voice to be heard above the wind. "Not far," he replied, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The road should turn east just ahead, toward the shelter of the trees. But when they reached what should have been the turning point, there was no road to be seen. The snow had obliterated all landmarks, leaving them in a world of white chaos. Edward pulled the horses to a halt, his expression grim as he tried to get his bearings. Amy watched him scan the landscape, searching for some familiar feature that might guide them home. She could see the worry etched in the lines around his eyes, could feel the tension radiating from his still form. They were lost in a blizzard, miles from shelter, with darkness approaching fast. "We need to find cover," Edward said finally. "The horses cannot go much farther in this." As if to emphasize his point, one of the horses stumbled, its legs trembling with exhaustion. Amy could see foam around its bit, could hear the labored sound of its breathing. These animals had given everything they had, and they were reaching the end of their endurance. Edward climbed down from the wagon, his boots disappearing into snow that came nearly to his knees. He moved to the horses' heads, speaking to them in low, soothing tones as he examined their condition. Amy could see him shake his head, his expression grave. "They cannot. Go on," he called up to her. "We need shelter now." Amy looked around at the endless expanse of white, feeling panic begin to claw at her chest. There was nothing to be seen in any direction. No trees, no rocks, no sign of human habitation. They were alone in the wilderness with a storm that showed no signs of abating. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she saw Edward begin to move with purpose. He unhitched the horses from the wagon, then led them to a slight depression in the land where a cluster of boulders provided some shelter from the wind. Working quickly despite the cold, he began to unsaddle the animals, his movements efficient and practiced. "What are you doing?" Amy called. "Making camp," he replied. "We will have to wait out the storm." Amy climbed down from the wagon, immediately sinking into snow up to her thighs. The cold was brutal, cutting through her clothes like knives. She struggled through the drifts to where Edward was working, determined to help despite her inexperience with such situations. "What can I do?" she asked. "Help me get the supplies from the wagon," Edward said. "We will need everything we can carry." Together, they unloaded the wagon, carrying their meager supplies to the shelter of the rocks. Edward had brought food for the journey, along with extra blankets and a small canvas tarp. It was not much, but it was all they had. Working with desperate efficiency, Edward stretched the tarp between two of the larger boulders, creating a crude but effective windbreak. He spread blankets on the ground beneath it, then gathered what dry wood he could find from the stunted pines that grew in the crevices between the rocks. Amy watched in amazement as he coaxed a fire to life, despite the wind and snow. His hands were steady and sure as he fed the tiny flame with twigs and pine needles, gradually building it into a blaze that threw blessed warmth into their makeshift shelter. The horses stood nearby, their heads down and their backs to the wind. Edward had covered them with the horse blankets from the wagon, but Amy could see they were suffering. Their survival, like her own, depended entirely on the skill and determination of the man beside her. As the fire grew stronger, Edward began to prepare a simple meal from their supplies. He heated water in a small pot, then added dried meat and vegetables to make a thin but nourishing stew. The smell of it made Amy's mouth water, reminding her that she had not eaten since their stop at the station house. "You should eat," Edward said, handing her a tin cup filled with the hot stew. "You need to keep your strength up." Amy accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around its warmth. The stew was simple but delicious, and she could feel it warming her from the inside out. Across the fire, Edward ate his own portion methodically, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "How long do storms like this usually last?" Amy asked. "It depends," Edward replied. "Could be a few hours, could be a few days. We will have enough food and fuel to last until morning, but after that things will become more difficult." Amy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They were trapped in the wilderness with minimal supplies, dependent entirely on Edward's knowledge of the mountains for their survival. "Have you been caught in storms like this before?" she asked. "A few times," Edward said. "When I first came to Colorado, I was not as careful as I should have been. I learned quickly that the mountains do not forgive mistakes." There was something in his voice that made Amy look at him more closely. In the flickering firelight, she could see old scars on his hands, the weathered look of someone who had faced hardship and survived. She wondered again what had brought him to this remote place, what had driven him to seek a wife through correspondence rather than finding one among the women of the territory. "Where did you come from originally?" she asked. "Before Colorado." Edward was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Pennsylvania," he said finally. "I had a farm there. A wife. Both are gone now." Me heard the pain in his voice and did not press for details. Everyone carried their own burdens, their own losses. She understood the need to leave the past behind, to start fresh in a place where no one knew your history. The wind continued to howl around their shelter, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. Amy pulled her blankets tighter around herself, grateful for the warmth of the fire, but acutely aware of how precarious their situation was. They were completely at the mercy of the storm, with no way to call for help and no guarantee that anyone would even know to look for them. Edward seemed to sense her growing anxiety. "You should try to get some sleep," he said. "I will keep watch and tend the fire." Amy wanted to protest, to insist that she could take her turn at watch, but she could see the exhaustion in Edward's face and knew that he was far better equipped to handle this situation than she was. Reluctantly, she arranged her blankets as comfortably as possible and tried to settle down for the night. But sleep was elusive. The wind seemed to grow stronger as the hours passed, and she could hear it whistling through the rocks above their heads. The fire crackled and danced, casting wild shadows on the canvas walls of their shelter. Every few minutes, Edward would add more wood to the flames or check on the horses, his movements quiet but constant. Despite her fear, Amy found herself watching him through half-closed eyes, studying this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to hardship, someone who had learned to find solutions in impossible situations. There was a strength about him that went beyond physical capability, a quiet determination that she found deeply reassuring. As the night wore on, the storm seemed to intensify. Amy could hear the wind roaring overhead like a freight train, could feel the ground trembling beneath her as great gusts battered their shelter. Once, a particularly strong gust nearly tore away their tarp, and Edward had to leap up to secure it before their precious warmth escaped into the night. It was during one of these moments, as Edward struggled to retie the canvas in the howling wind, that Amy heard something that made her blood run cold. Over the sound of the storm, she could hear something else, something that did not belong in the wilderness. Voices. At first, she thought she must be imagining things, that the wind was playing tricks on her ears. But as she listened more carefully, she was certain she could hear men calling to each other somewhere in the darkness beyond their shelter. Edward heard it too. She could see him freeze in the act of securing the tarp, his head tilted as he listened intently. His hand moved slowly to the rifle that lay beside his bedroll, and Amy felt her heart begin to race. Who could be out in weather like this? What kind of men would be traveling through a blizzard in the middle of the night? Edward motioned for her to be quiet, then moved carefully to the edge of their shelter. Amy could see him peering out into the swirling snow, his body tense and ready for action. The voices were getting closer, and now she could make out individual words carried on the wind. "This way," one voice called. "I can see light ahead," Edward cursed under his breath and turned back to Amy, his expression grim. "We have visitors," he said quietly, "and I do not think they are the kind we want to meet." Amy felt panic begin to rise in her throat. "Who are they?" she whispered. "I do not know," Edward replied, checking his rifle to make sure it was loaded. "But honest men do not travel in weather like this. Stay low and stay quiet." The voices were very close now, and Amy could hear the sound of boots crunching through the snow. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the rocks, trying to make herself as small as possible. Through the gap between the tarp and the rocks, Amy could see the glow of torches approaching through the storm. The light danced wildly in the wind, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach toward their hiding place with grasping fingers. Edward crouched beside her, his rifle ready, his eyes fixed on the approaching lights. The voices became clearer as the men drew near. Amy could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, their words carrying across the snow despite the howling wind. "Got to be around here somewhere," one man called. "Saw the smoke from their fire. Probably froze to death by now," another voice replied with a harsh laugh. "Save us the trouble." Amy felt Edward tense beside her at those words. These were not travelers seeking shelter from the storm. These were men with darker purposes, men who meant them harm. The torchlight grew brighter, and Amy could see the silhouettes of 3 figures moving through the snow. They were bundled in heavy coats and carried rifles, their movements purposeful despite the brutal conditions. These were men accustomed to violence, comfortable with it even. Edward leaned close to Amy, his voice barely a whisper. "When I give the signal, you run for the horses. Take the mare, she is the steadier of the 2. Ride east until you find the road, then follow it south to town." Amy stared at him in horror. "I cannot leave you here alone." "You can and you will," Edward said firmly. "I will not have your death on my conscience." But before Amy could protest further, one of the approaching men called out in a voice that carried clearly over the storm. "We know you are in there. Come out peaceful-like, and no one gets hurt." Edward stood slowly, keeping his rifle ready, but not yet aimed. Amy could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was weighing their options. They were outnumbered and trapped, with nowhere to run and limited ammunition. "What do you want?" Edward called back, his voice steady despite their desperate situation. "Just a friendly chat," the man replied, and Amy could hear the menace beneath his casual tone. "About a certain debt that needs settling." Amy felt confusion mixed with her fear. What debt could Edward possibly owe to men like these? But she could see understanding dawn in Edward's face, could see his jaw clench with what looked like resignation. "I told Brandon Myers I would have his money by spring," Edward said. "The winter has been hard, but I will honor my debts." "Spring is a long way off," the voice replied. "Brandon is tired of waiting. He sent us to collect what is owed, one way or another." Amy's mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. Edward owed money to someone named Brandon Myers, someone who apparently employed men willing to travel through a blizzard to collect debts. The implications were terrifying. "I do not have the money with me," Edward said. "It is back at my homestead." "Then I guess we will just have to take what we can find," the man replied, "starting with that pretty little lady you got hiding in there." Amy felt ice form in her veins. How could they possibly know about her, unless they had been watching the station, had followed them from town? Edward's knuckles went white on his rifle. "She has nothing to do with this," he said, his voice carrying a warning that was unmistakable. "Maybe not," the man replied, "but she might be worth something to the right buyer." Lot of lonely men in these mountains, willing to pay good money for female companionship. The crude laughter that followed those words made Amy's skin crawl. She understood now what kind of men they were dealing with, what fate awaited her if they were captured. These were not simple debt collectors. They were predators, men who would take whatever they wanted and leave nothing but destruction in their wake. Edward raised his rifle, his intention clear. Amy could see the determination in his stance, the way he had positioned himself between her and the approaching men. He was prepared to fight, prepared to, if necessary, to protect her. But they were still outnumbered, still trapped with no way of escape. The storm that had seemed like such a threat now felt like their only ally, the swirling snow that might provide cover if they could somehow break free of their rocky shelter. Last chance, the voice called. Come out now and we will make this quick. Make us come in there and things will go hard for both of you. Amy could see the torchlight growing brighter as the men moved closer to their shelter. In moments they would be discovered, and then Edward would have to fight 3 armed men in close quarters with no room to maneuver. But as the men approached, Amy heard something that gave her a sudden spark of hope. One of the horses, frightened by the voices and the approaching light, whinnied loudly and began to pull against its tether. The sound was followed by the crash of hooves as both animals spooked and tried to flee. The distraction was brief, but it was enough. Edward grabbed Amy's hand and pulled her toward the back of their shelter, where the rocks formed a narrow passage that led deeper into the hillside. This way, he whispered urgently. Stay low and stay quiet. They crawled through the gap between the rocks, Amy's heavy skirts catching on the rough stone. Behind them, she could hear the men shouting as they discovered their empty shelter, could hear them cursing as they tried to catch the panicked horses. The passage led to a small cave hidden behind the boulders, a natural formation that provided perfect concealment. Edward pulled Amy inside and motioned for her to stay down while he positioned himself where he could watch the entrance. They could hear the men searching their abandoned camp, could hear them arguing about what to do next. The storm was getting worse, and even these hardened criminals were beginning to feel the effects of the cold. Tracks lead this way, one voice called, but the snow is covering them fast. Forget it, another man replied. They cannot have gone far in this weather. We will find their bodies come morning. Amy held her breath as she listened to the discussion, praying that the men would give up their search. The cave was small and cramped, barely large enough for 2 people, but it was dry and hidden from view. Check the horses, the first voice ordered. Maybe we can get something for them at least. There was more shouting and cursing as the men tried to catch the spooked animals, but the horses had broken free and disappeared into the storm. Eventually, the voices began to fade as the men moved away from their hiding place. Edward waited a long time before he spoke, listening carefully for any sign that their pursuers might return. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was grim. They will be back, come morning, he said. We need to be gone before then. Amy felt exhaustion wash over her as the full implications of their situation sank in. They had escaped immediate capture, but they were still lost in a blizzard with no supplies and no shelter. The horses were gone, along with their food and blankets. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and Edward's rifle. Who is Brandon Myers, Amy asked. What kind of debt could be worth sending men out in weather like this? Edward was quiet for a long moment, his face invisible in the darkness of the cave. He is a man who owns half the territory, he said finally, and he does not like to be kept waiting. But why do you owe him money? What happened? Edward sighed, and Amy could hear years of regret in that sound. I needed capital to expand my homestead, to buy more cattle. Myers was the only man willing to lend the money, but his terms were harsh. When the harsh winter killed most of my herd, I could not make the payments. Amy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. How much do you owe him? More than I can ever repay, Edward admitted. That is why I placed the advertisement for a wife. I thought perhaps with 2 people working the land, we might have a chance of earning enough to satisfy the debt. The full scope of their predicament was becoming clear to Amy. Edward was not just a lonely homesteader seeking companionship. He was a desperate man trying to save his land and his life from a powerful enemy. And now, by coming west as his bride, she had become a target as well. What will they do if they catch us? Amy asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. Edward's silence was answer enough. Amy closed her eyes and tried to think, tried to find some way out of their impossible situation. They were trapped in a cave with armed men hunting them, lost in a blizzard with no supplies or transportation. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt a spark of the same determination that had brought her west in the first place. She had survived poverty and loss, had found the courage to leave everything behind and start over in a new place. She would not give up now. There has to be a way, she said aloud. Some way to reach your homestead or get to town. Edward turned toward her in the darkness. The storm will not last forever, he said. When it clears, we might be able to find our way. But Meyer's men know this country as well as I do. They will be watching the roads. Then we do not take the roads, Amy said. You know this land. There must be other ways to travel, paths they would not think to watch. Edward was quiet for a moment, considering her words. There are old mining trails in these mountains, he said slowly. Paths that were used during the gold rush, but have been abandoned for years. They are dangerous, especially in winter, but they might give us a chance. Amy felt hope stir in her chest. How far to your homestead by those trails? 2 days on foot, maybe 3 in this weather, Edward replied. If we can make it that far. It was not much of a chance, but it was better than staying here and waiting for their pursuers to return. Amy had come too far to give up now, had risked too much to let fear defeat her. Then that is what we will do, she said firmly. When the storm breaks, we will take those trails and make for your homestead. Edward reached out in the darkness and found her hand, squeezing it gently. You do not understand what you are saying, he said. Those trails are treacherous even in good weather. In winter, they are a death trap. Amy squeezed his hand back, drawing strength from the contact. I understand perfectly, she said, but I would rather die trying to reach safety than wait here for those men to find us. Outside their cave, the wind continued to howl and the snow continued to fall. But Amy no longer felt helpless in the face of the storm. She had found her courage at last, had discovered a strength she had not known she possessed. Whatever came next, she would face it standing beside the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. Together, they would find a way to survive, or they would die trying. The choice was theirs to make. The storm raged for 3 more hours before the wind finally began to subside. Amy had dozed fitfully against Edward's shoulder, startling awake each time the cave echoed with the sound of shifting ice or distant voices carried on the wind. When she finally opened her eyes to see pale gray light filtering through the cave entrance, she realized that dawn was breaking over the mountains. Edward was already awake, his rifle across his knees as he watched the entrance with unwavering attention. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes remained alert. Amy wondered if he had slept at all during the long night. The storm is passing, he said quietly when he noticed she was awake. We should move soon, while we still have the cover of the remaining snow. Amy sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in her joints from sleeping on the cold stone floor. Her dress was damp and wrinkled, and she could feel ice crystals in her hair where her breath had frozen during the night. But she was alive, and that was more than she had dared hope for when those men had first appeared out of the blizzard. Do you think they are still out there? She asked, keeping her voice low. Edward nodded grimly. Men like that do not give up easily. They will wait for better weather, then begin searching in earnest. We need to be well away from here before they start. He moved carefully to the cave entrance and peered out into the gray morning light. The snow was still falling, but gently now, the fierce wind reduced to occasional gusts that stirred the drifts without adding to them. Amy could see him studying the landscape, planning their route with the careful attention of a man whose life depended on making the right choices. The mining trail starts about a mile north of here, Edward said. If we can reach it without being seen, we might have a chance. But it will be dangerous. The path is narrow and exposed in places, and one wrong step could send us over a cliff. Amy felt a shiver of fear, but she pushed it aside. She had not come this far to be defeated by her own timidity. I am ready, she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. Edward turned back to her, his expression serious. You need to understand what we are facing. The trail we will be taking was carved out by miners desperate for gold. They cared nothing for safety, only for speed. In some places, the path is barely wide enough for one person. In others, it crosses exposed ridges where the wind can knock you off your feet. Amy met his gaze steadily. And if we stay here, then Meyer's men will find us, and we will both be dead before noon, Edward said bluntly. At least on the trail, we have a chance. Then we take the trail, Amy said firmly. Better to die trying than to wait here like trapped animals. Edward studied her for a moment, and Amy thought she saw something like respect in his eyes. Very well, he said, but you must do exactly as I say when I say it. One moment of hesitation or panic could kill us both. Amy nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. She had lived her entire life in cities, had never faced anything more dangerous than a crowded street or an aggressive predator. But desperation had a way of revealing strengths that people never knew they possessed. They gathered what few possessions they had left. Edward's rifle and the small amount of ammunition he carried, Amy's carpet bag, which contained her sister's letters and the few personal items she had brought from Chicago. It was pitiful preparation for a journey through treacherous mountain terrain, but it was all they had. Edward went first, moving carefully through the rocks that surrounded their hiding place. Amy followed, trying to step in his footprints to avoid making unnecessary noise. The snow was knee-deep in places, and she could feel the cold seeping through her boots with each step. They moved slowly through the forest, staying among the trees where possible to avoid being seen from a distance. Amy could hear Edward's breathing, steady and controlled despite the exertion of breaking trail through the snow. Her own breath came in short puffs that created small clouds in the frigid air. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Edward stopped and held up his hand for silence. Amy froze, straining her ears for whatever had caught his attention. At first, she heard nothing but the whisper of wind through the pine branches. Then faintly, she caught the sound of voices in the distance. "They are searching the area where we camped last night," Edward whispered. "We need to move faster." The urgency in his voice sent a spike of adrenaline through Amy's system. She could feel her heart racing as they picked up their pace, moving as quickly as they dared through the treacherous terrain. Behind them, the voices were getting louder, and she could hear the sound of men calling to each other as they spread out to search. The mining trail, when they finally reached it, was even worse than Edward had described. What had once been a path was now little more than a ledge carved into the side of the mountain, barely wide enough for a single person to walk. In places, the trail had been washed away entirely by years of rain and snow, leaving gaps that would have to be jumped or climbed around. Edward tested the first section carefully, making sure the rock was solid before committing his full weight to it. The trail curved around the mountainside, following the natural contours of the rock face. To their left, the mountain rose steeply upward, covered with loose scree and patches of ice. To their right, the ground dropped away into a chasm so deep that Amy could not see the bottom. "Stay close to the rock face," Edward instructed. "Do not look down, and do not let yourself think about the drop. Focus only on the next step and the step after that." Amy nodded, though her mouth was too dry to speak. The trail was even more terrifying than she had imagined, but the sound of their pursuers behind them left no room for hesitation. She pressed herself against the cold stone and began to follow Edward along the narrow ledge. The first 100 yards were the worst. Amy's legs trembled with each step, and she had to fight the urge to look down into the abyss beside her. The wind was stronger here on the exposed mountainside, and she could feel it tugging at her heavy skirts, trying to pull her off balance. But gradually she found her rhythm. Edward moved with the steady confidence of someone who had traveled such paths before, and his calm presence helped to steady her nerves. She began to trust her footing, to move with more assurance despite the treacherous conditions. They had been on the trail for perhaps an hour when they heard the first shout from behind them. Amy's blood turned to ice as she realized their pursuers had found the trail and were following them. The voices echoed off the rock walls, making it impossible to tell how close the men were, but they were definitely gaining ground. "We need to move faster," Edward said. But Amy could hear the concern in his voice. The trail ahead curved around a sharp bend in the mountainside, disappearing from view. Beyond that bend lay unknown dangers, but also their only hope of escape. They picked up their pace, moving as quickly as they dared on the narrow ledge. Amy's heart pounded with exertion and fear, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind them, the voices were getting closer, and she could hear the sound of boots on stone as their pursuers navigated the same treacherous path. The trail around the bend was even worse than what they had already traveled. Here, the ledge was so narrow that they had to turn sideways and shuffle along with their backs pressed against the rock face. The drop to their right seemed to go on forever, and Amy could feel vertigo trying to claim her as she fought not to look down. It was here that disaster struck. Amy's foot slipped on a patch of ice that had formed where water seeped from a crack in the rock. For a terrifying moment, she felt herself falling backward toward the edge of the trail. Her arms windmilled frantically as she tried to regain her balance, but gravity was pulling her inexorably toward the drop. Edward's hand shot out like a striking snake, catching her wrist just as she began to tip over the edge. His grip was like iron, and she could feel his muscles straining as he hauled her back onto the narrow ledge. For a moment, they both pressed against the rock face, breathing hard from the close call. "Are you hurt?" Edward asked, his voice tight with concern. Amy shook her head, though her legs were trembling so badly she could barely stand. The reality of how close she had come to death left her shaken and weak. If Edward had not been there, if his reflexes had been even a fraction slower, she would have plummeted into the chasm below. "We cannot stop," Edward said gently but firmly. "They are still coming." As if to emphasize his words, a shout echoed from behind them, closer now than before. Their pursuers had reached the narrow section of trail and were making good time despite the dangerous conditions. Amy forced herself to start moving again, though every instinct screamed at her to find somewhere safe to hide. The trail ahead seemed to stretch on forever, a thin line of stone carved into the unforgiving mountainside. But there was no choice except to keep going, to trust in Edward's knowledge of the mountains and her own determination to survive. The trail began to climb more steeply as they worked their way around the mountainside. Amy's lungs burned in the thin air, and she could feel her strength beginning to flag. The heavy wool dress that had seemed so practical in Chicago now felt like a burden, its waterlogged fabric clinging to her legs and making every step more difficult. Edward seemed to sense her growing exhaustion. He stopped at a slightly wider section of the trail, where a large boulder provided some shelter from the wind. "Here," he said quietly. "Rest for a moment." Amy gratefully sank down onto a relatively flat rock, trying to catch her breath. Her hands were numb with cold despite her gloves, and she could feel ice forming in her hair where her breath had frozen. The thin air at this altitude made every breath a struggle, and she wondered how much farther they could go before exhaustion forced them to stop. Edward kept watch while she rested, his eyes constantly scanning the trail behind them for signs of pursuit. The voices had grown fainter in the last few minutes, but Amy knew their hunters were still back there, still following their trail through the snow. "How much farther to your homestead?" she asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. "We are perhaps halfway there," Edward replied, "but the worst part of the trail is still ahead of us. There is a section where we will have to cross an exposed ridge. If the weather turns bad again, we could be in serious trouble." Amy looked up at the sky, which was still overcast but no longer actively snowing. The clouds seemed to be thinning somewhat, but she could see darker formations building on the horizon. Another storm was coming, and they were trapped on a mountainside with nowhere to take shelter. "We should keep moving," she said, forcing herself to stand despite the protests from her aching legs. "The longer we stay in one place, the more time we give them to catch up." Edward nodded and shouldered his rifle. The trail ahead curved upward around another bend, climbing toward what looked like a saddle between two peaks. Amy could see that the path became even narrower there, if such a thing were possible. They resumed their careful progress along the ledge, moving single file with Edward in the lead. The trail surface was treacherous here, covered with loose stones and patches of ice that made every step uncertain. Amy found herself relying more and more on handholds in the rock face, using her fingers to maintain balance when her feet could not find secure purchase. The wind was getting stronger as they climbed higher, and Amy could feel it cutting through her clothes like knives. Her dress, already damp from the snow, was beginning to freeze in the bitter air. She could feel ice crystals forming on the fabric, making it stiff and uncomfortable. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers had grown fainter, but they had not disappeared entirely. The men following them were clearly experienced in mountain travel, able to navigate the treacherous trail almost as quickly as Edward, despite the dangerous conditions. The trail reached its narrowest point just before the ridge crossing. Here, the ledge was barely 18 inches wide, with a sheer drop of hundreds of feet on one side and an equally steep slope of loose rock on the other. Edward stopped and turned back to Amy, his expression grave. "This is the most dangerous part," he said. "The trail is unstable here, and the wind will try to knock you off balance. You must move quickly but carefully. Do not hesitate, and do not look down." Amy nodded, though her throat was too tight with fear to speak. She could see the concern in Edward's eyes, could tell that he was genuinely worried about her ability to make this crossing. The knowledge that even he was afraid made her own terror that much worse. Edward went first, moving with careful deliberation across the narrow ledge. Amy watched as he tested each step, making sure the rock would support his weight before committing to it. The wind buffeted him constantly, and she could see him fighting to maintain his balance as he worked his way across. When he reached the other side, he turned and motioned for her to follow. Amy took a deep breath and stepped out onto the narrow ledge, immediately feeling the full force of the wind trying to push her off the trail. The drop beside her seemed to yawn like a hungry mouth, waiting for her to make a mistake. She moved as quickly as she dared, trying not to think about the abyss beside her. The wind was relentless, coming in gusts that threatened to tear her away from the rock face. Halfway across, a particularly strong gust caught her heavy skirts and nearly sent her tumbling over the edge. Edward's voice carried across the wind, steady and reassuring. "You are doing well. Just a little farther." Amy forced herself to keep moving, focusing only on the next handhold, the next footstep. The rock face beside her was rough and cold, but it was solid, reliable in a way that nothing else in her world seemed to be anymore. She was 3/4 of the way across when she heard the shout from behind her. One of their pursuers had reached the narrow section and was calling to his companions. The voice was much closer than she had expected, close enough that she could make out individual words. There they are, on the ridge. Amy felt panic surge through her, but she forced herself to keep moving. Edward was reaching out to her now, his hand extended to help her across the last few feet of the treacherous crossing. She could see the determination in his face, the absolute refusal to let her fall. Her fingers closed around his wrist just as her foot slipped on the icy rock. For a terrifying moment, she hung suspended over the abyss, supported only by Edward's grip and her own desperate hold on his arm. Then he was pulling her up, hauling her bodily onto the wider section of trail beyond the crossing. They both collapsed against the rock face, breathing hard from exertion and relief. Amy could feel tears freezing on her cheeks, though she was not sure when she had started crying. The crossing had been the most terrifying experience of her life, but they had made it. Edward helped her to her feet, his hands gentle but urgent. "We cannot rest here," he said. "They will be across in a few minutes, and this section of trail offers no cover." Amy nodded and forced her trembling legs to carry her forward. The trail ahead was wider and more stable than what they had just crossed, but it was also more exposed. They were on the ridge now, with the wind howling across the open mountainside and no shelter in sight. Behind them, she could hear their pursuers beginning the dangerous crossing. The voices were muffled by the wind, but she could tell the men were arguing about something, probably debating whether the pursuit was worth the risk. The trail descended slightly as it followed the ridgeline, winding between massive boulders that had been deposited by ancient glaciers. Edward led the way with renewed urgency, clearly wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and their hunters before the men completed their own crossing. They had been moving for perhaps 20 minutes when Edward suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. Amy froze, straining her ears to hear whatever had caught his attention. At first, she heard nothing but the wind whistling through the rocks. Then gradually she became aware of a new sound, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from somewhere ahead of them. "Horses," Edward said grimly. "Riders coming up the other side of the ridge." Amy felt her heart sink. If there were more of Meyer's men approaching from ahead, they would be trapped on the exposed ridge with nowhere to run. The narrow trail offered no room to maneuver, and the steep slopes on either side made escape impossible. "How many?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. Edward listened carefully for a moment. "At least 3, possibly more. They are moving fast, which means they know we are here." Amy looked around desperately for some place to hide, but the ridge offered little cover. The boulders scattered along the trail were too small to conceal 2 people, and the slopes on either side were too steep to climb quickly. "There," Edward said, pointing to a cluster of rocks about 50 yards ahead. "It is not much, but it might give us some protection." They hurried toward the rocks, moving as quickly as they dared on the uneven trail. Amy could hear the sound of approaching horses getting louder, and she knew they had only minutes before the riders reached their position. The rocks formed a rough circle about 10 feet across, with gaps between them that offered limited visibility in all directions. Edward positioned himself where he could watch the trail ahead, while Amy kept an eye on the route they had just traveled. His rifle was ready, though Amy knew they had precious little ammunition for a prolonged fight. The riders appeared around a bend in the trail, moving at a careful trot despite the treacherous conditions. Amy counted 4 men, all heavily armed and bundled against the cold. They rode with the easy confidence of people who knew these mountains well, and their eyes constantly scanned the trail ahead for signs of their quarry. Edward raised his rifle and sighted carefully on the lead rider. Amy could see the tension in his shoulders, could tell he was preparing to fight despite the overwhelming odds against them. She found herself holding her breath, waiting for the shot that would signal the beginning of what might well be their final battle. But the shot never came. Instead, Edward slowly lowered his rifle, his expression shifting from grim determination to something that might have been relief. "Those are not Myers' men," he said quietly. "That is Alexander Lee and his brothers. They run cattle in the valley below my homestead." Amy felt a surge of hope so intense it made her dizzy. "Allies," she said. "They might help us." Edward was already standing and waving to get the rider's attention. "Alexander," he called. "Alexander Lee." The lead rider pulled up short, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun before he recognized Edward's voice. "Edward Cox," the man called back. "What in blazes are you doing up here in weather like this?" "Running from Brandon Myers's men," Edward replied without preamble. "They are hunting us, and they are not far behind." Alexander Lee was a man in his 40s, weathered and lean like most mountain ranchers. His 3 companions were clearly his brothers, sharing the same angular features and steady gray eyes. They were all armed and looked like men who knew how to handle trouble. "Myers," Alexander spat, "that snake has been causing problems all over the territory. What does he want with you?" "Money I owe him," Edward said simply, "and the lady with me." Alexander's eyes shifted to Amy, taking in her bedraggled appearance and obvious exhaustion. His expression softened slightly as he saw the fear in her face. "How many men are following you?" he asked. "3 that we know of," Edward replied. "Maybe more. They caught us in the storm last night and have been tracking us since dawn." Alexander exchanged glances with his brothers, and Amy could see them weighing their options. These men had no obligation to help strangers, especially when doing so might put them in danger from Brandon Myers and his hired guns. But Alexander Lee was apparently not the kind of man to abandon people in need. "We will take you to our ranch," he said finally. "It is closer than your homestead, and we have enough men there to discourage Myers from trying anything foolish." Amy felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. After hours of running and hiding, the prospect of safety seemed almost too good to believe. But Edward's expression remained cautious. "Myers will not forget this kindness," he warned. "You could be making an enemy." Alexander smiled grimly. "Myers has been trying to run small ranchers out of this territory for years. He is already my enemy. At least this way, I get to choose when and where to face him." The sound of voices echoing from the trail behind them cut short any further discussion. Their pursuers had completed the dangerous crossing and were making good time along the ridge. Alexander Lee's expression hardened as he heard the approaching men. "Aaron," he said to one of his brothers, "take the lady on your horse. We need to move fast." Aaron Lee, a younger version of Alexander with the same steady demeanor, dismounted and helped Amy up onto his horse. She had never ridden astride before, and the unfamiliar position felt awkward and precarious. But it was infinitely better than trying to outrun armed men on foot. Edward swung up behind Alexander, his rifle still ready despite their improved circumstances. The other 2 brothers, who had introduced themselves as Brandon Sanchez and Jessica Thomas, took positions at the rear of the group, watching the trail behind them for signs of pursuit. The horses picked their way carefully down the far side of the ridge, following a trail that was somewhat wider and more stable than the mining path they had been traveling. Amy clung to the saddle horn as Aaron's horse negotiated the steep descent, trying not to think about what would happen if the animal lost its footing on the icy rocks. Behind them, she could hear their pursuers reaching the crest of the ridge. Angry voices carried on the wind as Myers's men discovered that their quarry had acquired allies. There was a brief discussion, but the voices gradually faded as the group descended into the valley below. The Lee Ranch lay in a broad valley surrounded by towering peaks, a collection of sturdy log buildings clustered around a central courtyard. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Amy could see cattle gathered in the shelter of a large barn. It looked like a place where people could make a stand, where they could defend themselves if necessary. Alexander led them directly to the main house, a 2-story log structure with a wide porch and solid shutters on all the windows. Several men emerged from the barn and other outbuildings as they rode up, all of them armed and alert. These were clearly people who had learned to be ready for trouble. "Get the lady inside and warmed up," Alexander ordered as they dismounted. "Aaron, send someone to watch the trail. I want to know the moment Myers' men show themselves in this valley." Amy found herself ushered into the ranch house by a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and capable hands. The warmth inside was overwhelming after hours of exposure to the bitter mountain air, and Amy felt her knees go weak as the heat began to penetrate her frozen clothing. "You poor dear," the woman said, guiding Amy to a chair near the massive stone fireplace. "I am Diane Parker, Alexander's wife. Let us get you out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." Amy wanted to protest that she was fine, but the words would not come. The stress and exhaustion of their flight had finally caught up with her, and she found herself shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to wear off. Diane Parker seemed to understand, wrapping Amy in warm blankets and pressing a cup of hot coffee into her hands. Through the window, Amy could see Edward and Alexander Lee standing on the porch, their heads together in serious conversation. Other men were taking positions around the ranch buildings, preparing for the possibility of an attack. The sight should have been reassuring, but Amy could not shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Diane Parker brought her dry clothes, simple but well-made garments that belonged to one of Alexander's daughters. Amy changed gratefully, feeling more human as she shed her frozen dress and put on warm, dry fabric. The clothes were a bit large for her, but they were clean and comfortable, and that was all that mattered. When she emerged from the bedroom where she had changed, she found Edward waiting in the main room of the house. He had also been given dry clothes, and someone had bandaged a cut on his hand that she had not noticed before. He looked tired but determined, and his eyes brightened when he saw her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gentle with concern. "Better," Amy replied, and was surprised to find that it was true. The warmth and safety of the ranch house had done wonders for her spirits, even though she knew their situation was still precarious. Alexander Lee entered the room, his expression serious. "My men are in position," he said. "If Myers' hired guns try anything, we will be ready for them. But I do not think they will risk a direct assault. They know we have them outnumbered." Edward nodded, but Amy could see the worry in his face. "Myers will not give up easily," he said. "He has too much invested in collecting what he thinks I owe him." "What exactly is the nature of this debt?" Alexander asked. "How much money are we talking about?" Edward was quiet for a moment, clearly reluctant to discuss his financial troubles. $5,000, he said finally, plus interest and penalties. "It might as well be 50,000 for all the chance I have of paying it." Alexander whistled softly. "That is a substantial sum. What did you need that much money for?" "Cattle," Edward replied. "I thought I could build up my herd, increase my income enough to make the payments. But the winter was harsh, and I lost most of the animals. Now I have nothing to show for the debt except empty pastures and a homestead that Myers wants to claim as collateral." Amy listened to this exchange with growing understanding of Edward's situation. He was not just a man seeking a wife for companionship. He was fighting for his very survival, trying to hold on to the life he had built in these mountains against forces that seemed determined to destroy him. "There might be another way," Alexander said thoughtfully. "Myers has been pressuring small ranchers all over the territory, forcing them into debt and then seizing their land when they cannot pay. If we could organize the other ranchers, present a united front against his tactics, we might be able to force him to negotiate more reasonable terms." Edward shook his head. "Myers has the law on his side. The contracts are legal, even if the terms are harsh. And he has enough hired guns to enforce his will if legal means fail." "Maybe," Alexander said, "but he also has enemies, men who have lost their ranches to his schemes, families he has driven from their homes. If we could bring them together, show them that Myers can be opposed, we might have a chance." Amy found herself thinking about the letters she had read from her sister, the dreams of a new life in the Colorado territory that had brought her west. Those dreams had been built on the promise of honest work and fair dealing, the belief that a person could make a better life through determination and effort. Men like Brandon Myers threatened all of that, turning the territory into a place where only the wealthy and ruthless could prosper. "I want to help," she said suddenly, surprising both men with the firmness in her voice. "Whatever we can do to stop Myers, I want to be part of it." Edward stared at her in amazement. Amy, you do not understand what you are saying. This could be dangerous, more dangerous than anything we have faced so far. I understand perfectly, Amy replied. I came west seeking a new life, a chance to build something worthwhile. I will not let men like Myers destroy that chance. Not for me, and not for others who deserve better. Alexander smiled at her words, clearly impressed by her determination. You have chosen well, Edward, he said. A woman with that kind of courage is worth more than all the cattle in Colorado. Before Edward could respond, one of Alexander's men burst through the front door, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. Riders approaching from the north, he reported. At least 6 men, maybe more. They are flying a white flag, but they are all armed. Alexander's expression hardened. Myers's men, he said. They want to parley. Or they want to get close enough to see our defenses, Edward suggested grimly. Myers is not the kind of man to give up easily. Only one way to find out, Alexander said, checking his rifle. We will meet them in the yard, but keep the men ready for trouble. They filed out onto the porch where Amy could see the approaching riders clearly for the first time. They were a hard-looking bunch, the kind of men who made their living with guns and intimidation. But they were indeed flying a white flag, and their weapons were holstered. The lead rider was a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and expensive clothes that marked him as someone of importance. Amy guessed this was Brandon Myers himself, come to personally oversee the collection of Edward's debt. Myers pulled up about 20 yards from the porch, close enough to talk but far enough away to avoid any sudden moves. His eyes swept over the assembled defenders, taking note of their numbers and positioning. Amy could see him calculating odds, weighing his options. Alexander Lee, Myers said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. I should have known you would involve yourself in matters that do not concern you. Any man who threatens innocent people in my valley concerns me, Alexander replied evenly. What do you want, Myers? Myers' gaze shifted to Edward, and Amy could see the cold calculation in his eyes. I want what is owed to me, he said. Edward Cox has a debt to settle, and I have come to collect it. The debt is not due until spring, Edward said, stepping forward despite the obvious danger. I told your men I would have the money by then. Myers smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Circumstances have changed, he said. Recent events have made me question your ability to honor your obligations. I am calling in the debt immediately. You have no legal right to do that, Alexander said. The contract specifies payment terms, and those terms have not been violated. I have every right, Myers replied smoothly. The contract includes a clause allowing me to demand immediate payment if the debtor engages in activities that threaten the security of the loan. Running from my representative certainly qualifies as such activity. Amy felt anger surge through her at the man's arrogance. He was twisting the law to suit his purposes, using legal technicalities to justify what was essentially theft. She could see the same anger in Edward's face, the frustration of a man who had tried to play by the rules only to discover that his opponent was willing to cheat. What are your terms? Alexander asked, clearly trying to find some middle ground. Simple, Myers said. Edward Cox will surrender his homestead and all livestock as payment for the debt. In addition, he will turn over the woman who has been traveling with him. I have use for her services. The crude implication in those words made Amy's skin crawl. She could see Edward's hands clench into fists, could feel the tension radiating from every man on the porch. Myers was not just demanding payment of a debt. He was making it personal, adding insult to injury in a way calculated to provoke a violent response. The woman is under my protection, Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet. She goes nowhere unless she chooses to. Myers shrugged as if the matter were of little importance. Then I suppose we have nothing more to discuss, he said. I will give you until sunset to reconsider. After that, I will take what I am owed by whatever means necessary. He wheeled his horse around and rode off with his men, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with tension and the promise of violence. Amy could see the grim determination in the faces of the men around her, the knowledge that they were facing a fight they might not be able to win. How many men does he have? Edward asked. More than we do, Alexander replied honestly, but we have the advantage of position and the motivation of defending our homes. That counts for something. Amy looked out at the valley where Myers and his men had disappeared, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This confrontation was happening because of her, because she had fled west under false pretenses and drawn Edward into danger. The knowledge that others might die because of her choices was almost unbearable. But even as guilt threatened to overwhelm her, she felt something else stirring in her chest. Anger at Myers' arrogance, determination to stand up to the kind of men who used wealth and violence to crush anyone who stood in their way. She had spent too many years being afraid, too many years accepting whatever life handed her without fighting back. Not anymore. The afternoon passed in tense preparation for what everyone knew was coming. Alexander's men checked their weapons and ammunition, while the women and children were moved to the most secure parts of the ranch buildings. Amy found herself helping Diane Parker organize supplies and tend to the younger children, trying to keep them calm despite the obvious fear of the adults around them. Edward spent most of his time with Alexander and the other men, planning their defense and discussing strategy. Amy could see the weight of responsibility in his shoulders, the knowledge that this confrontation was ultimately his fault. She wanted to go to him, to offer what comfort she could, but the constant activity around the ranch left little time for private conversation. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, Amy found herself standing on the porch watching the approaches to the ranch. The waiting was almost worse than the danger itself. The knowledge that violence was coming, but not knowing when or how it would arrive. Diane Parker joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cold air. "You are worried about Edward," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Amy admitted. "He is a good man who has been caught in an impossible situation. I feel responsible for making things worse." Diane studied her with eyes that had seen too much hardship to be shocked by much of anything. "You care for him," she said. Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not deny it. "He showed me kindness when he had every right to turn me away," she said. "He has protected me when he could have saved himself by abandoning me. How could I not care for such a man?" "Then you understand why we are willing to fight," Diane said. "Good men are rare in this territory, and they deserve to be protected." Before Amy could respond, a shout went up from one of the sentries posted around the ranch. Riders approaching from the south. More than before. Amy felt her heart sink as she saw the dust cloud rising in the distance. Myers had returned with reinforcements, and from the size of the cloud, he had brought significantly more men than before. The odds, which had never been good, were now becoming overwhelming. Alexander appeared on the porch, his rifle in his hands and his face grim with determination. "How many?" he called to the sentry. "At least 15, maybe 20, came the reply. "They are spread out in a line, approaching from multiple directions." Amy could see Edward emerge from the barn, his own rifle ready despite the hopeless nature of their situation. His eyes found hers across the yard, and she could see him trying to communicate something, some message of reassurance or farewell that the distance made impossible to interpret. The approaching riders came into view as they crested a low hill about half a mile from the ranch. Amy could see that they were indeed spread out in a line, approaching from several directions simultaneously to prevent any chance of escape. Myers was clearly planning to overwhelm them with superior numbers, to make resistance futile. But as the riders drew closer, Amy began to notice something strange about their formation. They were not advancing in the coordinated manner she would have expected from hired gunmen. Instead, they seemed to be approaching cautiously, almost hesitantly, as if they were unsure of their welcome. Alexander must have noticed the same thing, because he lowered his rifle slightly and peered more intently at the approaching men. "Those are not all Myers' men," he said slowly. "I recognize some of those riders." As the group drew closer, Amy could see that Alexander was right. While some of the men were clearly the same hired guns who had been with Myers earlier, others were dressed like ranchers and farmers, ordinary men who looked uncomfortable with the weapons they carried. The group stopped about 100 yards from the ranch buildings, and Amy could see Myers in heated discussion with several of the other riders. Whatever he was saying, it was clear that not all of his companions agreed with him. Finally, one of the men broke away from the group and rode forward alone. Amy recognized him as one of the ranchers she had seen in town, a weather-beaten man with honest eyes who had nodded politely when she passed him on the street. "Alexander Lee," the man called. "I am sorry to intrude, but we need to talk." "Come ahead, Aaron Brooks," Alexander replied. "But come alone, and keep your hands where I can see them." Aaron Brooks dismounted and walked slowly toward the porch, his hands raised to show he carried no weapon. His face was troubled, and Amy could see the conflict in his expression as he approached. Alexander, he said when he was close enough to speak without shouting, Myers came to us with a story about you harboring fugitives, about how you were interfering with legitimate business. He convinced some of us that we had a duty to help him maintain order in the territory. And now, Alexander said, now I see a good man defending his home against a bully, Brooks replied. And I remember all the times Myers has used his money and influence to crush anyone who stood up to him. I am not proud of being here, Alexander. None of us are. Amy could see the relief in Alexander's face, the hope that perhaps this confrontation might be resolved without bloodshed. But she could also see Myers in the distance, his face dark with anger as he realized his carefully laid plans were falling apart. What do you propose? Alexander asked. We go home, Brooks said simply. All of us. Myers can settle his business with Edward Cox through the courts like civilized men. There has been enough violence in this territory, but even as Brooks spoke, Amy could see Myers spurring his horse forward, his hired guns following close behind. The rancher's words had apparently pushed him beyond the point of rational negotiation. Look out, Edward shouted from across the yard. Myers is coming. The next few minutes passed in a blur of shouting and gunfire. Myers and his remaining men charged toward the ranch buildings, their weapons drawn and their intentions clear. The ranchers who had come with them scattered, unwilling to be part of what was clearly becoming a massacre rather than a legitimate law enforcement action. Alexander's men opened fire from their positions around the ranch, and Amy could see several of Myers' riders fall from their horses. But there were still too many attackers, and they were spread out across too wide a front for the defenders to stop them all. Amy found herself pressed against the wall of the ranch house as bullets splintered the wooden porch around her. Diane Parker was beside her, clutching a rifle of her own and watching for any chance to help defend their home. Through the chaos, Amy could see Edward moving from position to position, his rifle cracking steadily as he tried to help turn back the attack. He moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced violence before. But Amy could see that he was taking risks, exposing himself to enemy fire in his determination to protect the people who had helped them. A bullet shattered the window above Amy's head, showering her with glass. She pressed herself lower against the wall, feeling helpless and terrified as the battle raged around her. This was her fault, she knew. If she had never come west, if she had never involved Edward in her deception, none of these good people would be in danger. But even as guilt and fear threatened to overwhelm her, Amy felt something else stirring in her chest. Anger at Myers and his hired killers, determination not to let them destroy the lives of innocent people. She looked around and saw Diane's rifle leaning against the wall nearby, apparently dropped when the older woman had moved to a different position. Without thinking, Amy grabbed the weapon and checked to make sure it was loaded. She had never fired a gun in her life, but she had watched her father clean his hunting rifle many times as a child. The basic principles seemed simple enough. Amy, what are you doing? Diane called, seeing her with the weapon. What I should have done from the beginning, Amy replied. Fighting back, she moved to the broken window and peered out at the chaos in the yard. Myers was there, directing his men from horseback while staying safely out of range of the defenders' weapons. His face was twisted with rage and frustration as he saw his carefully planned attack falling apart. Amy raised the rifle and sighted carefully on Myers, trying to remember everything her father had taught her about shooting. The weapon was heavier than she had expected, and her hands trembled with fear and adrenaline. But her resolve was steady as she took aim at the man who had brought so much violence and suffering to this peaceful valley. The shot, when it came, was louder than she had expected. The recoil knocked her backward, and for a moment she thought she had missed entirely. But then she saw Myers clutch his shoulder and nearly fall from his horse, his face contorted with pain and surprise. The effect on his men was immediate and dramatic. Seeing their leader wounded, several of the hired guns began to retreat, unwilling to continue a fight that was clearly not going their way. Others pressed their attack more desperately, but their coordination was broken and their morale was failing. Edward appeared at Amy's side, his face a mixture of amazement and concern. Are you hurt? He asked, checking her for injuries. I am fine, Amy replied, though her hands were still shaking from the recoil and the shock of what she had done. Is it over? Edward peered out at the yard, where the sounds of gunfire were beginning to fade. Myers was retreating with his remaining men, clutching his wounded shoulder and shouting orders that his demoralized followers were increasingly reluctant to obey. I think so, Edward said. You may have just saved all our lives. Amy looked out at the battlefield, where several of Myers' men lay motionless in the dirt, while others helped their wounded leader retreat toward the hills. The sight should have filled her with satisfaction, but instead she felt only a deep weariness and a profound sense of loss. So much violence, she said quietly. So much suffering, all because one man refused to accept that he could not have everything he wanted. Edward put his arm around her shoulders, and Amy leaned into his warmth gratefully. It is over now, he said. Myers will think twice before trying something like this again. But Amy was not so sure. Men like Brandon Myers did not give up easily, and she suspected this was only the beginning of their troubles. Still, they had survived this day, and that was more than she had dared hope for when she first saw those riders approaching across the valley. The defenders began to emerge from their positions, checking on the wounded and assessing the damage to the ranch buildings. Miraculously, none of Alexander's people had been seriously hurt, though several of the buildings bore the scars of bullet holes and broken windows. Alexander himself appeared on the porch, his rifle still in his hands, but his expression relieved. Well fought, he said to Amy and Edward. You both showed courage today. Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks at the praise. She had never thought of herself as brave, had always seen herself as someone who avoided confrontation rather than seeking it. But perhaps desperation had revealed strength she had not known she possessed. What happens now, she asked. Will Myers give up his claim on Edward's debt? Alexander shook his head. Men like Myers do not give up that easily, he said. But this attack was illegal, and he knows it. If we can get word to the territorial authorities about what happened here today, we might be able to force him to negotiate more reasonable terms. It was not a complete victory, but it was hope, and that was more than Amy had dared expect. She looked out at the valley where Myers and his men had disappeared, knowing that this confrontation had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was no longer the frightened woman who had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge, no longer someone who accepted whatever fate handed her without fighting back. She had found her courage at last, had discovered that she was capable of standing up for what was right, even when it meant facing danger. The knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating, a reminder that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. Night fell over the Lee Ranch with an eerie quiet that seemed almost unnatural after the violence of the afternoon. The defenders maintained their watch posts, but the immediate danger appeared to have passed. Myers and his remaining men had retreated beyond the valley, licking their wounds and presumably planning their next move. Amy found herself in the ranch house kitchen, helping Diane Parker prepare food for the men who had risked their lives to defend strangers. The simple domestic task felt strange after the intensity of the battle, but there was something comforting about the familiar routines of cooking and serving. Edward appeared in the doorway, his rifle still close at hand despite the apparent calm. His clothes were dusty and torn from the fighting, and Amy could see a fresh bandage on his left arm where a bullet had grazed him. How is your arm? She asked, setting down the pot she had been stirring. It will heal, Edward replied, though she could see the pain in his eyes. The wound was clearly more serious than he was letting on, but she knew he would not admit to weakness while danger still threatened. Diane Parker looked up from the bread she was slicing. You should let Amy tend to that properly, she said. A wound like that needs cleaning and fresh bandages if it is going to heal right. Edward started to protest, but Amy was already moving toward him with a basin of warm water and clean cloth. Sit down, she said firmly. Let me look at it. Reluctantly, Edward allowed her to examine the wound. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his upper arm, leaving a deep furrow that was still seeping blood despite the rough bandage someone had applied during the fighting. Amy could see that it needed proper cleaning and stitching if it was going to heal without becoming infected. This needs more than I can do here, she said. You should see a doctor. The nearest doctor is in town, and that is 2 days right away, Edward replied. It will have to wait. Amy felt frustration rise in her chest. Men were always so stubborn about their injuries, so determined to prove their toughness that they risked making things worse. She had seen the same attitude in her father and the men who worked in the Chicago factories. This refusal to acknowledge pain or seek help when it was needed. Then I will do what I can here, she said, beginning to clean the wound with gentle but thorough strokes. I helped tend the sick in Chicago. I know enough to keep this from getting infected. Edward winced as she worked, but he did not pull away. His eyes remained fixed on her face, and Amy found herself acutely aware of his proximity, of the trust he was showing by letting her care for him. There was something intimate about the moment that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with simple human connection. You were very brave today, Edward said quietly as she worked. I have never seen anyone learn to shoot so quickly or aim so well under pressure. Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks. I was terrified, she admitted. I have never been so afraid in my life. Courage is not the absence of fear, Edward said. It is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You saved lives today, Amy. You saved my life. The simple sincerity in his voice brought tears to her eyes. She had spent so many years feeling useless, feeling like a burden on everyone around her. The knowledge that she had actually helped, that her actions had made a difference, was almost overwhelming. Alexander Lee entered the kitchen, his expression grave despite their apparent victory. We need to talk, he said to Edward. About what comes next. Amy finished bandaging Edward's arm and stepped back, knowing that the men needed to discuss strategy without her presence. But Edward caught her hand before she could leave. Stay, he said. This concerns you as much as anyone. Alexander nodded agreement. You have proven yourself today, Miss Johnson. You have earned the right to be part of these discussions. Amy felt a surge of gratitude at being included, at being treated as an equal, rather than someone who needed to be protected from unpleasant realities. She took a seat at the kitchen table, listening carefully as Alexander outlined their situation. Myers will not give up, he said without preamble. Today was a setback for him, but men like that do not accept defeat easily. He will regroup and try again, probably with more men and better planning. What are our options? Edward asked. Limited, Alexander replied honestly. We can try to get word to the territorial authorities about what happened here. But Myers has influence in high places. He might be able to convince them that we were the aggressors, that he was simply trying to collect a legitimate debt. Amy felt her heart sink at the implications. Even their victory today might be turned against them if Myers could manipulate the legal system to his advantage. The man seemed to have resources and connections that made him nearly untouchable. There might be another way, Edward said slowly. I could leave the territory, give up my claim to the homestead. If I am not here, Myers has no reason to threaten any of you. Absolutely not, Amy said before she could stop herself. Both men turned to look at her in surprise, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she pressed on, determined to make her point. Running away solves nothing. Myers will just find another target, another family to terrorize. Someone has to stand up to him. Alexander smiled at her words. The lady has a point, he said. Myers has been using these tactics all over the territory. If we can organize the other ranchers, show them that he can be opposed, we might be able to put an end to his schemes once and for all. But that it would mean war, Edward said. Real war, with all the death and destruction that comes with it. Are we prepared for that? Amy thought about the question seriously, weighing the alternatives in her mind. War was terrible, she knew that. But sometimes it was the only way to stop something even worse. Myers and men like him represented a kind of tyranny that crushed everything good and decent in its path. I would rather fight than live in fear, she said finally. I would rather risk everything than accept a world where bullies like Myers can destroy innocent people without consequence. Edward stared at her for a long moment, and Amy could see something like wonder in his eyes. When did you become so fierce? He asked softly. When I realized I had something worth fighting for, Amy replied, meeting his gaze steadily. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken meaning. Amy could feel the connection between them deepening, strengthening in the face of shared danger and mutual respect. Whatever happened next, she knew that her feelings for Edward had moved far beyond gratitude or simple companionship. Alexander cleared his throat, breaking the moment. If we are going to do this, we need to move quickly, he said. Myers will use the time to gather more men and plan his next attack. We need to reach out to the other ranchers, convince them to stand with us before he can intimidate them into submission. How many men can we count on? Edward asked. Hard to say, Alexander replied. Aaron Brooks showed today that not everyone is willing to follow Myers blindly. If we can get word to the right people, explain what is really happening here, we might be able to build a coalition strong enough to oppose him. Amy listened to the discussion with growing excitement. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, she felt like she was part of something important, something that could make a real difference in people's lives. The scared, desperate woman who had fled Chicago seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who was ready to fight for what was right. "I want to help," she said. "Whatever we need to do, I want to be part of it." Edward reached across the table and took her hand in his. "It will be dangerous," he warned. "More dangerous than anything we have faced so far." "I understand," Amy replied, "but I also understand that some things are worth the risk." Alexander stood up, his expression determined. "Then we had better get started," he said. "We have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it." As they began to plan their campaign against Myers, Amy felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She had come west seeking a new life, and she had found something even better. She had found a cause worth fighting for, people worth protecting, and a man worth standing beside no matter what the future might bring. The frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength and was not afraid to use it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Amy Johnson was ready to face them with courage and determination. The war against Brandon Myers was just beginning, but Amy was no longer afraid of the outcome. She had found her place in this harsh but beautiful land, and she would defend it with everything she had. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility, and Amy embraced it with open arms. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Lee Ranch, with low clouds promising more snow before the day was through. Amy woke from a restless sleep in the guest room Diane Parker had prepared for her dreams filled with images of gunfire and bloodshed. The events of the previous day seemed almost unreal in the pale morning light, but the sound of men's voices outside her window reminded her that the danger was far from over. She dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Diane already preparing breakfast for the men who had stood watch through the night. The older woman's face showed the strain of the past 24 hours, but her movements remained steady and efficient. "How did you sleep, dear?" Diane asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Not well," Amy admitted. "I keep thinking about what Myers might be planning next." Diane nodded understanding. "Men like that do not give up easily," she said. "But Alexander has dealt with his type before. He will know what to do." Through the kitchen window, Amy could see Edward and Alexander standing in the yard with several other men, their heads together in serious discussion. Maps were spread on a makeshift table, and she could see them pointing to various locations as they talked. "What are they planning?" Amy asked. Reaching out to the other ranchers in the territory, Diane replied, "If they can convince enough people to stand together against Myers, they might have a chance of stopping him permanently." Amy watched the men for a moment, noting the grim determination in their faces. These were people who had carved lives out of the wilderness through hard work and perseverance, and they were not going to give up without a fight. A rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch at a gallop. Amy felt her heart leap with fear, wondering if Myers had returned with reinforcements. But as the rider drew closer, she could see it was Aaron Brooks, the rancher who had refused to participate in the previous day's attack. Alexander and Edward hurried to meet Brooks as he dismounted, their expressions tense with anticipation. Amy could not hear what was being said, but she could see the urgency in the newcomer's gestures, the way he kept pointing back toward the hills where he had come from. After a few minutes of intense discussion, Alexander turned and strode toward the house. His face was grave, and Amy felt a chill of premonition as he approached. "What is it?" Diane asked as Alexander entered the kitchen. "Myers has been busy during the night," Alexander replied. "Brooks says he has been riding from ranch to ranch, threatening anyone who might be thinking of opposing him. 3 families have already packed up and left the territory rather than face his retaliation." Amy felt her heart sink. If Myers could intimidate people into leaving without even fighting, their cause might be lost before it truly began. The man's reputation for violence was apparently enough to cow those who might otherwise stand up to him. "But there is also good news," Alexander continued. "Brooks has been talking to some of the other ranchers, and several are willing to meet with us." They are tired of living in fear of Myers and his hired guns. When and where? Edward asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway. Tomorrow night, at the old mining camp up in Devil's Canyon, Alexander replied. It is isolated enough that Myers should not be able to spy on us, but accessible enough that people can reach it without too much difficulty. Amy felt a spark of hope at this news. If they could bring together enough people, if they could show that Myers could be opposed, they might have a chance of building the coalition they needed. I want to come to the meeting, she said, surprising both men with her boldness. Edward shook his head immediately. It is too dangerous, he said. If Myers discovers the meeting, there could be violence. All the more reason for me to be there, Amy replied firmly. These people need to see that ordinary citizens are willing to stand up to Myers. They need to know that this is not just a fight between rival ranchers, but a struggle for the soul of the territory. Alexander studied her thoughtfully. She has a point, he said finally. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against a bully is the courage of those he thinks are helpless. Edward looked like he wanted to argue further, but Amy could see him reconsidering. The practical part of his mind was apparently recognizing the value of her presence at the meeting, even if his protective instincts rebelled against the idea. Very well, he said reluctantly, but you stay close to me at all times, and if shooting starts, you get to cover immediately. Amy nodded agreement, though she suspected that if violence erupted, staying in cover would be the least of their worries. The meeting would be a crucial test of whether they could build the alliance they needed to oppose Myers effectively. The rest of the day passed in preparation for the journey to Devil's Canyon. Amy helped Diane organize supplies for the men who would be traveling, while Edward and Alexander continued their discussions with the various ranchers who had come to offer their support. As evening approached, Amy found herself standing on the porch watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The beauty of the landscape was breathtaking, all purple shadows and golden light painting the snow-covered mountains. It was hard to believe that such a peaceful scene could hide so much conflict and danger. Edward joined her on the porch, his arm still bandaged, but his color improved from the previous day. The wound was healing well under Amy's careful attention, though she knew it would be weeks before he regained full use of the arm. Having second thoughts, he asked, following her gaze toward the mountains. No, Amy replied without hesitation. This is where I belong now. This is where I want to make my stand. Edward was quiet for a moment, and Amy could sense him struggling with something. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Amy, there is something I need to tell you, he said, about my past, about why I came to Colorado in the first place. Amy turned to face him, seeing the pain in his eyes. You do not have to tell me anything you do not want to, she said gently. I think I do, Edward replied. If we are going to face whatever comes next together, you deserve to know the truth about the man you are standing beside. Amy waited patiently, sensing that this was difficult for him. The evening light cast shadows across his weathered face, making him look older and more careworn than his years. I told you I had a farm in Pennsylvania, and a wife, he said finally. What I did not tell you was how I lost them. Amy felt her heart clench with sympathy, but she remained silent, letting him tell his story in his own way. Her name was Sarah, Edward continued. We had been married for 5 years, and she was carrying our first child. I thought we had everything we needed, a good farm, a loving marriage, a future full of promise. He paused, staring out at the darkening mountains. Then the war came, he said, the Civil War. I thought it was my duty to serve, to help preserve the Union. Sarah begged me not to go, but I was young and foolish and full of ideas about honor and duty. Amy could see where this was leading, could feel the weight of old grief in his words. I was gone for 3 years, Edward said. 3 years of fighting and killing and watching good men die for causes they barely understood. When I finally came home, I found that Sarah had died in childbirth the previous winter. She and the baby both. Amy felt tears spring to her eyes at the pain in his voice. I am so sorry, she whispered. The farm was in ruins, Edward continued. Sarah had tried to keep it going alone, but it was too much for one person. The neighbors had helped as much as they could, but they had their own problems. By the time I returned, there was nothing left to save. Amy reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his struggles. So you came west, she said. I could not stay there, Edward replied. Everything reminded me of what I had lost, of the choices I had made that cost me everything I cared about. I thought if I could start over in a new place, I might be able to find some kind of peace. And did you? Amy asked. For a while, Edward said. The work was hard, but it was honest. I built my homestead with my own hands, carved a life out of the wilderness. I thought I had found the peace I was looking for. Until Myers came along, Amy said. Until Myers came along, Edward agreed. And until a certain woman stepped off a train in Cedar Ridge, carrying a lie that somehow became the most important truth in my life. Amy felt her breath catch at his words, at the quiet intensity in his voice. Edward, she began, but he placed a finger gently over her lips. I know you are not Margaret, he said. I know you came here under false pretenses, running from a life you could not bear to continue. But I also know that you are braver and stronger than you realize, that you have brought something into my life I thought I had lost forever. What is that? Amy asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Hope, Edward said simply. The belief that tomorrow might be better than today, that there are still things in this world worth fighting for. Amy felt tears running down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, she felt truly understood, truly accepted for who she was, rather than who she pretended to be. I love you, Edward, she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. I know I have no right to say that. I know our arrangement was supposed to be practical, but I cannot help how I feel. Edward smiled, and Amy could see years of pain beginning to lift from his shoulders. I love you too, he said. I think I have loved you since that first day at the station, when you stood there in the snow and told me the truth despite your fear. They stood together on the porch as darkness fell over the valley, holding each other close against the cold and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges that would test their resolve and their relationship. But tonight they had found something worth fighting for. The war against Brandon Myers was far from over, but Amy and Edward would face it together, united by love and strengthened by the knowledge that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. They were fighting for the right to build a life based on honesty and hard work, for the dream of a territory where decent people could prosper without fear of men like Myers. Whatever the future held, they would meet it side by side, ready to defend the life they were building together against anyone who tried to take it away. The mountains stood silent around them, eternal guardians of the valley that had become their home. And in that silence, Amy Johnson finally found the peace she had been seeking since the day she left Chicago, the knowledge that she belonged somewhere at last. The morning of the meeting at Devil's Canyon arrived with a bitter wind that cut through the valley like a blade. Amy woke before dawn to find frost covering the inside of her window, delicate patterns of ice that reminded her of the lace curtains her mother had once hung in their Chicago home. The memory brought both comfort and sadness, a reminder of how far she had traveled from the woman she used to be. Edward was already up and moving about the ranch, checking weapons and supplies for the journey ahead. Amy could see him through her window, his movements careful but determined despite the wound in his arm. The bandage she had applied the previous evening was still clean and secure, but she knew the injury pained him more than he would admit. Diane Parker had breakfast ready when Amy made her way to the kitchen, the older woman's face drawn with worry, despite her attempts to maintain a cheerful demeanor. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the warm room, a stark contrast to the harsh cold waiting outside. You should eat well, Diane said, placing a plate before Amy. It will be a long day, and you will need your strength. Amy nodded and forced herself to eat, though her stomach was tight with nervousness about what lay ahead. The meeting at Devil's Canyon would determine whether they could build the coalition needed to stand against Brandon Myers, or whether they would face his retaliation alone and outnumbered. Alexander Lee entered the kitchen, his expression grim but resolute. The weather is turning worse, he reported. Snow is coming, and the wind is picking up. We need to leave soon if we want to reach the canyon before the storm hits. Through the window, Amy could see dark clouds building on the horizon, their heavy bellies promising more snow before the day was through. The sight filled her with unease, reminding her of the blizzard that had nearly killed them just days before. Edward appeared in the doorway, his rifle slung across his good shoulder and his coat buttoned against the cold. Are you ready? He asked Amy, his eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt. Amy stood and reached for her own coat, the heavy wool garment that had become her armor against the harsh mountain weather. "I am ready," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The journey to Devil's Canyon took them through some of the most treacherous terrain Amy had yet encountered in Colorado. The old mining trail they followed was little more than a suggestion carved into the mountainside, barely wide enough for their horses and fraught with loose rocks and hidden ice. Amy rode behind Edward on his sturdy gelding, her arms wrapped around his waist as they navigated the narrow path. She could feel the tension in his body, the constant vigilance required to keep them safe on the dangerous trail. Behind them, Alexander and two of his men followed at careful intervals, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding peaks for signs of trouble. The wind grew stronger as they climbed higher into the mountains, driving snow before it in stinging curtains that made visibility poor. Amy pulled her scarf tighter around her face, feeling ice crystals forming on the wool where her breath froze in the bitter air. "How much farther?" she called to Edward over the howling wind. "Not far now," he replied, though she could hear the concern in his voice. "The storm is moving faster than I expected." Amy looked up at the sky, where the clouds seemed to be racing overhead with unnatural speed. The light had taken on that peculiar gray quality that preceded heavy snowfall, and she could feel the pressure dropping as the weather system approached. They reached Devil's Canyon just as the first heavy flakes began to fall. The old mining camp was a collection of abandoned buildings clustered around a frozen stream, their roofs sagging under years of accumulated snow. Most of the structures were little more than ruins, but a few still offered shelter from the elements. Other riders were already there, their horses tethered in the lee of the largest building. Amy counted at least 8 men, more than she had dared hope for. These were the ranchers and farmers who had decided to take a stand against Myers, despite the obvious risks. Alexander led them to the main building, where a fire had already been started in the old stone fireplace. The interior was crude but functional, with rough wooden benches and a few tables that had survived the years since the mine closed. The warmth was a blessed relief after the bitter cold of the ride. Aaron Brooks was there, along with several other men Amy recognized from town. They looked up as the newcomers entered, their faces showing a mixture of determination and apprehension. These were not professional fighters, but ordinary people who had been pushed too far by Myers and his tactics. "Glad you could make it," Brooks said to Alexander. "We were starting to worry the weather might keep you away." "It will take more than snow to stop us," Alexander replied, though Amy could see him glancing toward the windows where the storm was intensifying. "How many others are coming?" "2 more groups, maybe 3, Brooks answered, "but this storm might keep some folks away. Travel's getting dangerous out there." As if to emphasize his words, the wind howled around the building with renewed fury, and Amy could hear snow pelting against the windows like thrown sand. The storm was definitely getting worse, and she wondered if they would be able to return to the ranch before it became too dangerous to travel. Edward helped her to a seat near the fire, his movements protective despite the presence of allies. She could see him studying the other men, weighing their capabilities and commitment. These were good people, but they were not soldiers. If it came to a fight with Myers and his hired guns, courage alone might not be enough. More riders arrived over the next hour, their numbers growing to nearly 20 men. Amy was encouraged by the turnout, but she could also see the fear in many faces. These people had families to protect, livelihoods that could be destroyed if they chose the wrong side in this conflict. Alexander stood before the assembled group, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the storm outside. "Friends," he began, "we all know why we are here. Brandon Myers has been terrorizing this territory for too long, using debt and violence to steal what honest people have built with their own hands." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Amy could also see doubt in some faces. Myers had a reputation for ruthlessness that made even brave men think twice about opposing him. 3 days ago, Alexander continued, Myers and his hired guns attacked my ranch in an attempt to collect a debt from Edward Cox. They were not content to work through the courts or negotiate reasonable terms. They came with guns, ready to kill anyone who stood in their way. Amy felt all eyes turned toward her and Edward, and she straightened in her chair despite her nervousness. These people needed to see strength, not fear, if they were going to be convinced to join the fight. "The lady you see here," Alexander said, gesturing toward Amy, "shot Myers herself when he threatened to take her as payment for the debt. She showed more courage in that moment than Myers has shown in his entire life. Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks at the attention, but she met the gazes of the assembled men steadily. She could see respect growing in their eyes, along with something that might have been hope. "What are you proposing?" asked one of the ranchers, a grizzled man with calloused hands and honest eyes. "That we stand together," Alexander replied. "That we form an alliance to protect each other from Myers and his tactics. Alone, we are vulnerable. Together, we are strong enough to resist him. And if he comes after us with his hired guns," another man asked, "what then?" "Then we fight," Edward said, standing beside Alexander. "We fight to protect our homes and our families. We fight because running away only encourages him to prey on the next victim." Amy could see the men weighing Edward's words, considering the risks and benefits of open resistance. These were practical people who understood that standing up to Myers would not be easy or safe. "I have something to say," Amy said, rising from her chair. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward her, and she felt a moment of panic at being the center of attention. But she forced herself to continue, knowing that her words might make the difference. "I am not from this territory," she said. "I came here from Chicago, running from a life I could no longer bear. I had nothing when I arrived, no money, no prospects, no hope for anything better." She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. "But the people of this territory showed me kindness. They gave me a chance to start over, to build something worthwhile with my own hands. Now Myers threatens to destroy all of that, to turn this beautiful land into a place where only the wealthy and ruthless can prosper." Amy could see her words having an effect on the assembled men, could see them nodding in agreement with her description of what was at stake. "I am willing to fight for this place," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am willing to risk everything to protect the life I have found here. If a woman from the city can find that kind of courage, surely the men who built this territory can find it too." The silence that followed was broken by Aaron Brooks, who stood and faced the group. "The lady is right," he said. "We have all worked too hard to build our lives here, to let Myers destroy them without a fight. I say we stand together." One by one, the other men voiced their agreement. Amy felt a surge of hope as she watched the coalition take shape, saw ordinary people finding the courage to stand up to a powerful enemy. It would not be easy, but they had a chance. Alexander began organizing the group, assigning them responsibilities and planning their strategy. Some men would return to their ranches to gather supplies and spread word of the alliance. Others would scout Myers' movements and report back on his activities. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the old mining building, Amy felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. These people had chosen to stand together, to risk everything for the chance of something better. It was exactly the kind of courage she had been seeking when she fled Chicago. Edward moved to her side, his expression proud and loving. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "I have never seen anyone speak with such conviction." Amy felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. For the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere, like she was part of something larger than herself. The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed plans being made for coordinating their resistance to Myers. When it finally broke up, the storm outside had intensified to the point where travel would be extremely dangerous. "We should wait for it to pass," Alexander said, studying the swirling snow through the window. "No sense in getting caught in a blizzard." But even as he spoke, one of the men who had been watching the trail burst through the door, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Riders coming," he gasped. "At least a dozen men, moving fast despite the storm." Amy felt ice form in her veins as the implications sank in. Myers had discovered their meeting, and he was coming with enough men to overwhelm them. They were trapped in the old mining camp with a storm raging outside and enemies approaching through the snow. "How far away?" Alexander demanded, already moving toward his rifle. "Maybe 10 minutes," the scout replied. "They are pushing hard, but the storm is slowing them down." Amy looked around the room at the assembled ranchers, seeing fear and determination warring in their faces. This was not how they had planned to make their stand against Myers, but circumstances had forced their hand. Edward moved to her side, his rifle ready despite his wounded arm. "Stay close to me," he said. "No matter what happens, stay close." Amy nodded, feeling strangely calm despite the approaching danger. She had found her courage at last, had discovered that she was capable of standing up for what was right, even when it meant facing death. Whatever happened next, she would meet it with dignity and strength. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, barely audible over the howling wind, but unmistakably real. Myers was coming, and the final confrontation was about to begin. The men moved with practiced efficiency despite the obvious danger, taking positions at the windows and barricading the door with heavy furniture. Amy found herself pressed against the wall near the fireplace, watching as the ranchers prepared to defend themselves against overwhelming odds. Alexander took charge of the defense, his military experience showing in the way he positioned his men to cover all approaches to the building. Edward stationed himself near Amy, his rifle ready and his eyes fixed on the main entrance. Through the frost-covered windows, Amy could see shapes moving through the swirling snow, dark figures on horseback approaching the mining camp with obvious hostile intent. Myers had brought more men than she had expected, enough to surround the building and prevent any chance of escape. The first shots came without warning, muzzle flashes visible through the storm as Myers' men opened fire on the building. Bullets splintered the wooden walls and shattered windows, filling the air with flying glass and debris. Amy pressed herself lower against the wall, feeling pieces of wood rain down around her as the attackers concentrated their fire on the building. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a constant roar of gunfire punctuated by the splintering of wood and the shouts of men. Edward returned fire through one of the broken windows, his shots carefully aimed despite the difficult conditions. Amy could see other defenders doing the same, their rifles cracking steadily as they tried to drive back the attackers. But the odds were heavily against them. Myers had brought at least 15 men, professional gunfighters who knew their business. The defenders were outnumbered and trapped, with no way to retreat and limited ammunition. A bullet struck the stone fireplace near Amy's head, sending chips of rock flying. She flinched but forced herself to remain calm, knowing that panic would only make things worse. These men were fighting to protect her and everything they had built in this territory. The least she could do was show courage in the face of danger. The attack continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Amy could hear Myers shouting orders to his men, directing them to concentrate their fire on specific areas of the building. He was trying to create breaches that would allow his men to storm inside. One of the ranchers cried out and fell back from his window, clutching his shoulder where a bullet had found its mark. Alexander immediately moved to help the wounded man, dragging him to safety behind an overturned table. "We cannot hold them off much longer," Alexander called to Edward over the sound of gunfire. "They have us pinned down and outnumbered." Amy could see the grim truth in his words. The defenders were running low on ammunition, and several more had been wounded by the constant barrage of bullets. It was only a matter of time before Myers' men overwhelmed their position. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Amy heard something that made her heart leap with hope. New gunfire was coming from outside, but it was not directed at their building. Instead, she could hear Myers' men shouting in confusion and alarm as they came under attack from an unexpected direction. Through the broken windows, she could see muzzle flashes from the surrounding hills, the distinctive crack of rifles firing from concealed positions. Someone was attacking Myers' men from behind, catching them in a crossfire that threw their assault into chaos. "Who is that?" Edward called, trying to see through the swirling snow. Alexander peered through one of the windows, his face breaking into a grin despite their desperate situation. "It is Jessica Thomas and her brothers," he said. "They must have seen the smoke from our fire and come to investigate." Amy felt a surge of relief as she realized what was happening. Jessica Thomas was one of the most respected ranchers in the territory, a woman who had built her spread through hard work and determination. If she had brought her men to help, the odds had suddenly shifted in their favor. The attack on Myers' position intensified, with rifle fire coming from multiple directions as more defenders emerged from concealment in the hills around the mining camp. Amy could hear Myers shouting frantically at his men, trying to regroup them in the face of this unexpected development. But his hired guns were not used to being on the receiving end of such treatment. Several of them broke and ran, abandoning their positions and fleeing into the storm. Others tried to return fire, but they were caught in the open with no cover, easy targets for the hidden marksman. The tide of battle was turning, but Amy knew it was not over yet. Myers was still out there with his remaining men, and he was not the kind of man to give up easily. He would regroup and try again, probably with even more vicious tactics. As if to prove her point, she heard Myers' voice cutting through the storm, raised in fury and desperation. "Burn them out," he screamed. "Set fire to the building." Amy felt terror grip her heart as she realized what he was planning. Fire was the one thing they could not defend against, especially in a wooden building filled with old mining equipment and debris. If Myers succeeded in setting the structure ablaze, they would be forced to flee into the open where his men could cut them down. Edward seemed to understand the danger as well. He moved quickly to Amy's side, his face grim with determination. "We need to get out of here," he said. "If they set this place on fire, we will be trapped." "But where can we go?" Amy asked. "They have us surrounded." Edward pointed toward the back of the building, where a partially collapsed wall created a gap large enough for a person to crawl through. "There is an old mine shaft behind the building," he said. "If we can reach it, we might be able to hide until help arrives." Amy nodded, understanding that they had no choice. Staying in the building meant certain death if Myers succeeded in setting it on fire. Their only chance was to try to escape while the attackers were distracted by the gunfire from the hills. Alexander overheard their conversation and moved to join them. "Take as many men as you can," he said to Edward. "I will stay here with the wounded and try to hold them off as long as possible." Edward shook his head firmly. "We all go together, or we all stay. I will not abandon wounded men to save myself." Amy felt a surge of love and admiration for Edward's courage, but she also knew that his nobility might get them all killed. Sometimes survival required difficult choices, and this was one of those times. "Alexander is right," she said, surprising both men with her words. "Someone needs to stay and cover our retreat, and someone needs to get word to the outside about what happened. Here, we cannot all die in this place." Before either man could argue, the smell of smoke began to fill the building. Myers had succeeded in setting fire to the structure, and flames were already beginning to lick at the wooden walls. They had only minutes before the building became a death trap. "Go," Alexander said firmly, pushing Edward toward the gap in the wall. "Take Amy and get out of here. That is an order." Edward hesitated for a moment, torn between his desire to stay and fight and his need to protect Amy. But the growing smoke and heat made the decision for him. He grabbed Amy's hand and pulled her toward the back of the building, where other men were already beginning to squeeze through the gap in the wall. The escape was harrowing, crawling through the narrow opening while bullets whistled overhead and flames began to consume the building behind them. Amy felt splinters tear at her clothes and smoke burn her lungs, but she forced herself to keep moving. They emerged into the storm behind the building, where the old mine shaft Edward had mentioned was barely visible through the swirling snow. It was little more than a hole in the mountainside, supported by rotting timbers and partially blocked by fallen rocks. But it was shelter, and that was all that mattered. One by one, the survivors squeezed into the narrow opening, pressing themselves against the cold stone walls as flames engulfed the building they had just abandoned. Amy found herself crammed against Edward in the cramped space, feeling his heart beating rapidly against her back. Around them, she could hear the labored breathing of the other survivors, men who had risked everything to stand up to Myers and his tyranny. Through the entrance to the mine shaft, she could see the building burning fiercely despite the snow, orange flames reaching toward the dark sky like grasping fingers. The sight filled her with sadness for what was lost, but also with determination to make their sacrifice meaningful. The gunfire outside was beginning to diminish, and Amy could hear voices calling to each other through the storm. She could not tell if they belonged to friends or enemies, but the sound suggested that the battle was winding down. Edward squeezed her hand in the darkness, his touch reassuring despite their desperate circumstances. "We will get through this," he whispered. "We will survive, and we will make Myers pay for what he has done." Amy nodded, though she knew he could not see her in the darkness of the mine shaft. She believed his words, not because their situation had improved, but because she had finally learned to have faith in herself and the people who stood beside her. Whatever happened next, she would face it with courage and dignity. She had come too far and overcome too much to give up now. Hours passed in the cramped confines of the mine shaft, the survivors huddled together for warmth as the storm raged outside. Amy could hear the wind howling through the mountains, driving snow before it with relentless fury. The temperature was dropping steadily, and she could feel ice forming on the walls of their rocky shelter. Edward had positioned himself between Amy and the entrance, his rifle ready despite the limited space. Other men were arranged throughout the narrow tunnel, their weapons trained on the opening in case Myers' men discovered their hiding place. The burning building had collapsed into smoldering ruins, the flames finally extinguished by the heavy snow. But the smoke still hung in the air, acrid and choking, a constant reminder of how close they had come to death. Amy could hear voices outside occasionally, carried on the wind, but too distant and muffled to understand. She could not tell if they belonged to Myers's men searching for survivors or to Jessica Thomas and her allies trying to locate the missing defenders. One of the wounded men, a rancher named Michelle Nelson who had taken a bullet in the leg, was beginning to show signs of serious distress. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and Amy could see sweat beading on her forehead despite the bitter cold. "She needs medical attention," Amy whispered to Edward. "The wound is worse than it looks." Edward nodded grimly, but they both knew there was nothing they could do in their current circumstances. They were trapped in a mine shaft with limited supplies, surrounded by enemies and cut off from any hope of immediate rescue. Amy moved carefully through the cramped space to Michelle's side, doing what she could to make the wounded woman more comfortable. She had learned basic medical care during her years in Chicago, tending to injured workers in the factory where she had been employed. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of Michelle's thigh, missing the bone but causing significant blood loss. Amy used strips torn from her petticoat to create a proper bandage, working by touch in the darkness of the tunnel. "Thank you," Michelle whispered, her voice weak but grateful. "I thought I was going to die in that building." "You are not going to die anywhere," Amy replied firmly. "We are going to get out of here, and you are going to recover completely." But even as she spoke the words, Amy wondered if they were true. Their situation was desperate, trapped underground with limited food and water, while enemies searched for them above. Even if Myers eventually gave up and left the area, they might not survive long enough to emerge safely. A sound from outside made everyone freeze, the distinctive crunch of boots and snow approaching their hiding place. Edward raised his rifle, though Amy knew that firing from their cramped position would be almost impossible. The footsteps stopped just outside the entrance to the mine shaft, and Amy held her breath as she waited to see who had found them. If it was Myers' men, they would be trapped with no way to escape or defend themselves effectively. "Hello in there," a voice called softly. "This is Jessica Thomas. Are you all right?" Amy felt relief flood through her so intensely it made her dizzy. Jessica Thomas had found them, which meant they were no longer alone and trapped. Help had arrived at last. "We are here," Edward called back, keeping his voice low in case enemies were still in the area. "We have wounded who need attention." Jessica appeared at the entrance to the mine shaft, her weathered face creased with concern as she peered into the darkness. "How many of you are there?" she asked. "8," Edward replied, 3 wounded, but none critically. Jessica nodded and stepped back from the entrance. "The area is clear for now," she said. "Myers and his remaining men retreated about an hour ago, but they might come back with reinforcements." Amy felt hope stir in her chest as the survivors began to emerge from their rocky shelter. The storm was still fierce, but the immediate danger seemed to have passed. They had survived the attack, though at a terrible cost. Alexander Lee was among those who emerged, his face grim but determined. Several of his men had not made it out of the burning building, and Amy could see the weight of that loss in his shoulders. "How many did we lose?" Edward asked quietly. 4 good men," Alexander replied. "They died fighting to protect their homes and families. We will not let their sacrifice be in vain." Jessica Thomas had brought a dozen of her own men, all of them well-armed and experienced in mountain warfare. They had driven off Myers' attack force, but she was clearly concerned about what might come next. "Myers will not give up easily," she warned. "He has too much invested in this territory to walk away from a defeat. He will regroup and come back with more men and better planning." Amy listened to this discussion with growing understanding of what they faced. The battle at Devil's Canyon had been won, but the war was far from over. Myers would use his wealth and influence to gather more hired guns, and he would not make the same mistakes twice. But something had changed during the fight, something that gave Amy hope despite the challenges ahead. The ranchers and farmers of the territory had seen that Myers could be defeated, that his hired guns were not invincible. Word of the victory would spread, and more people would find the courage to stand up to his tyranny. We need to get the wounded to safety, Jessica said, looking at Michelle Nelson and the other injured survivors. My ranch is closest, and we have medical supplies there. Amy helped support Michelle as they made their way through the snow to where Jessica's men had horses waiting. The storm was beginning to weaken, though the wind was still bitter and the snow continued to fall steadily. The journey to Jessica's ranch took most of the remaining daylight, with the group moving carefully through treacherous terrain while keeping watch for any sign of Myers' men. Amy rode behind Edward again, grateful for his solid presence and the warmth of his body against the cold. Jessica's ranch was a substantial operation, with well-built log buildings and extensive corrals that spoke of years of successful work. The main house was large and comfortable, with a stone fireplace that filled the central room with blessed warmth. Amy helped tend to the wounded, while the men discussed strategy and plans for the future. Michelle's condition was serious but not life-threatening, and with proper care she would recover fully. The knowledge that they had saved lives as well as struck a blow against Myers filled Amy with quiet satisfaction. As evening fell, Amy found herself standing on the porch of Jessica's house, looking out at the snow-covered valley where the battle had been fought. The storm was finally beginning to clear, and she could see stars appearing between the racing clouds. Edward joined her on the porch, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the night sky. "It is beautiful," he said quietly. "Sometimes I forget how beautiful this country can be." Amy leaned against him, feeling the solid strength that had carried them through so much danger. "It is worth fighting for," she said. "All of this is worth protecting." Edward turned to face her, his expression serious in the starlight. "Amy, there is something I need to ask you," he said. "Something I should have asked long ago." Amy felt her heart begin to beat faster, sensing the importance of whatever he was about to say. "What is it?" she asked. Edward took her hands in his touch warm despite the cold night air. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because of some arrangement or practical necessity, but because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life with you." Amy felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Edward pulled her close and they kissed under the Colorado stars, their love finally acknowledged and celebrated despite the dangers that still surrounded them. Amy felt complete for the first time in her life, no longer running from her past, but embracing a future built on love and mutual respect. When they finally broke apart, Amy could see the happiness in Edward's eyes, the peace that came from knowing they would face whatever challenges lay ahead together. The frightened woman who had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge was gone forever, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and was not afraid to fight for what she believed in. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers as Myers regrouped and planned his next attack. But tonight, Amy Johnson had found everything she had been searching for when she fled Chicago. She had found love, courage, and a place where she truly belonged. The mountains stood silent around them, eternal guardians of the valley that had become their home. And in that silence, Amy finally understood that she had not just survived her journey west. She had been transformed by it, shaped into the woman she was always meant to be. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church at Cedar Ridge, with half the territory in attendance despite the continuing threat from Brandon Myers. Amy wore a simple white dress that Diane Parker had sewn for the occasion, its clean lines and modest elegance perfectly suited to the mountain setting. Edward stood waiting for her at the altar, his face radiant with happiness, despite the bandage still visible on his arm. The wound was healing well under Amy's careful attention, but it would be months before he regained full strength in the injured limb. Amy walked down the aisle on Alexander Lee's arm, the older man having volunteered to give her away in the absence of her own family. The church was packed with ranchers and farmers, townspeople and mountain men, all of them united in their determination to celebrate love in the face of adversity. The ceremony was simple but moving, with Reverend Laura Harris speaking eloquently about the bonds of marriage and the courage required to build a life together in the wilderness. Amy found herself thinking about her sister Margaret as she spoke her vows, wishing that the woman whose letters had brought her west could have seen this moment. When Edward slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Amy felt a completeness she had never experienced before. She was no longer Amy Johnson, the desperate woman who had fled Chicago under false pretenses. She was Amy Cox, wife of a good man and defender of a cause worth fighting for. The celebration afterward was held at Alexander's ranch, with tables laden with food and drink contributed by families throughout the valley. Music filled the air as someone produced a fiddle and others joined in with harmonica and guitar. For a few hours, the threat of Myers and his hired guns seemed distant and manageable. But even in the midst of celebration, Amy could see the tension in the faces around her. Scouts had reported increased activity at Myers's headquarters, with new men arriving daily to replace those lost in the battle at Devil's Canyon. The man was clearly planning something, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before he struck again. Jessica Thomas approached Amy during the festivities, her weathered face creased with a mixture of joy and concern. "You look beautiful," she said, embracing Amy warmly. "Edward is a lucky man. Thank you for everything you have done," Amy replied. "Without your help at Devil's Canyon, we would all be dead." Jessica waved away the thanks with characteristic modesty. "We look after our own in this territory," she said. "That is what neighbors do." But Amy could see the worry in Jessica's eyes, the knowledge that their victory had come at a high price. Myers would not forgive or forget what had happened, and his retaliation would be swift and brutal when it came. As the evening wore on, Amy found herself dancing with Edward to the soft strains of a waltz, their movements careful but graceful despite his injured arm. The other guests watched with obvious pleasure, these hard-working people taking joy in the happiness of two people who had found love against all odds. "You are the most beautiful bride in Colorado," Edward whispered in her ear as they swayed to the music. Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment, but she also felt the truth of his words in her heart. She was beautiful, not because of her appearance, but because of what she had become. The scared, desperate woman who had arrived in Cedar Ridge had been transformed into someone confident and strong, someone worthy of love and respect. The party continued late into the night, with stories and songs that celebrated the spirit of the territory and its people. Amy listened to tales of hardship and triumph, of families who had carved lives out of the wilderness through determination and mutual support. When the celebration finally ended, Amy and Edward retired to his homestead, which was now their home together. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the valley where their future lay waiting. Amy stood in the doorway, looking at the simple furnishings and rough wooden floors that would be the foundation of their married life. It was not the grand home she had once dreamed of, but it was theirs, built with honest work and defended with courage. Edward came up behind her, his arms encircling her waist as they looked out at their land together. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Amy leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her back. "I have never been happier," she said, and meant every word. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead in the clear mountain air. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges and dangers they could not yet imagine. But they would face it together, united by love and strengthened by the knowledge that they had already overcome more than most people faced in a lifetime. A sound from outside made them both tense, the distinctive whinny of a horse approaching through the darkness. Edward immediately moved to his rifle, his protective instincts taking over despite the peaceful nature of their wedding night. But the voice that called out was familiar and welcome. "Edward, Amy, it is Aaron Brooks. I have news." Edward opened the door to find the rancher standing in their yard, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgency. The man had clearly ridden hard through the night to reach them. "What is it?" Edward asked, though Amy suspected they both knew the answer. "Myers is moving," Brooks said without preamble. "My scouts report at least 30 men gathering at his headquarters, all of them armed and ready for war. He plans to strike tomorrow night." Amy felt ice form in her veins as the implications sank in. Myers had used the time since Devil's Canyon to gather a force large enough to overwhelm any resistance the ranchers could mount. Their wedding celebration had taken place in the shadow of approaching disaster. "Where will he strike first?" Edward asked. "Your homestead," Brooks replied grimly. "He wants to make an example of you, to show what happens to people who oppose him. After that, he plans to work his way through the valley, destroying anyone who supported you at Devil's Canyon." Amy felt anger surge through her at the man's vindictiveness. Myers was not content to simply collect his debt or drive them from the territory. He wanted to destroy them completely, to make their suffering a warning to others who might dare to resist his will. "How long do we have?" Amy asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Until tomorrow evening," Brooks replied. "Maybe less if he decides to move early." Edward was already moving, gathering weapons and supplies with the efficiency of a man accustomed to danger. "We need to warn the others," he said. "Get word to Alexander and Jessica. Tell them to gather their men and prepare for a siege." Amy watched her new husband preparing for what might be their final battle and felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had found love and purpose in this harsh land, had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. If this was to be their last stand, she would make it count. "I will not run," she said firmly, causing both men to look at her in surprise. "This is our home now, and I will not let Myers drive us away from it." Edward started to protest, but Amy cut him off with a gesture. "We have run enough," she said. "We have hidden and fled and let fear dictate our choices. No more. If Myers wants a fight, we will give him one he will never forget." Brooks nodded approval at her words. "The lady is right," he said. "Running will only delay the inevitable. Better to make our stand here where we know the ground and have the advantage of defense." Edward looked between them, seeing the determination in their faces. Finally, he nodded agreement. "Then we fight," he said simply. "We fight for our home and our future." Amy felt a surge of pride at his words, at the courage of this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. Tomorrow would bring the greatest challenge they had yet faced, but they would meet it together, united by love and strengthened by the knowledge that they were fighting for something worth dying for. The mountains stood silent around them, eternal witnesses to the courage of those who dared to build lives in their shadow. And in that silence, Amy Cox prepared to make her final stand against the forces that threatened everything she had come to love. Dawn broke gray and cold over the homestead, with clouds gathering on the horizon that promised more snow before the day was through. Amy woke early, her mind immediately focused on the preparations that needed to be made before Myers arrived with his army of hired guns. Edward was already up and moving, checking their defenses and organizing their meager supplies. The homestead was well positioned for defense, built on a slight rise with clear fields of fire in all directions, but it was still just one cabin against 30 armed men. Throughout the morning, allies arrived to help prepare for the siege. Alexander Lee came with 6 of his best men, their faces grim but determined. Jessica Thomas brought 4 of her brothers, all of them experienced fighters who had faced danger before. Amy worked alongside Diane Parker and the other women, preparing food and medical supplies for what was sure to be a long and bloody battle. They tore sheets into bandages and boiled water for cleaning wounds, their hands steady despite the fear that gripped their hearts. The men spent the day improving their defenses, building barricades from logs and furniture, creating firing positions that would give them the best possible advantage. Edward moved among them like a general, his natural leadership shining through despite his lack of formal military training. By afternoon, they had transformed the humble homestead into a fortress with overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions. It was not much against 30 professional gunmen, but it was the best they could do with limited time and resources. Amy found herself checking and rechecking the rifle she had used at Devil's Canyon, the weapon that had wounded Myers and helped turn the tide of battle. Her hands were steady as she loaded cartridges and adjusted the sights, muscle memory from her father's hunting lessons guiding her movements. Edward approached as she finished her preparations, his face showing both pride and concern. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly. "There is still time for you to leave, to get to safety before the fighting starts." Amy met his gaze steadily, seeing the love and fear warring in his eyes. "I am not going anywhere," she said firmly. "This is my home too, and I will defend it." Edward nodded, though she could see the worry in his expression. He knew as well as she did that their chances of survival were slim, that Myers had brought enough men to overwhelm their defenses through sheer numbers. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, scouts reported the approach of Myers's force. The enemy was moving slowly and deliberately, taking their time to position themselves for maximum effect. Amy took her position at one of the windows, her rifle ready and her heart beating steadily despite the approaching danger. Around her, she could hear the quiet conversations of the other defenders, men and women preparing to risk everything for the right to live free. Through her window, she could see riders emerging from the tree line, dark shapes against the snow that moved with military precision. Myers had indeed brought a substantial force, enough to crush any normal resistance through overwhelming firepower. But these were not normal circumstances, and the defenders were not ordinary people. They were men and women who had built lives in the wildernesses through courage and determination, who had faced down nature itself and emerged victorious. They would not go quietly into the night. The attack began at full dark, with muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the darkness around the homestead. The sound was deafening, a constant roar of gunfire that shook the cabin and filled the air with flying splinters. Amy sighted carefully on one of the attackers, a man who was trying to work his way closer to the cabin under cover of darkness. Her shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling into the snow. The battle raged for hours, with the defenders holding their ground despite the overwhelming odds against them. Amy lost count of how many shots she fired. Her world narrowed to the simple mechanics of loading, aiming, and firing. But gradually the attackers began to gain ground. They had more men and more ammunition, and they were willing to accept casualties that the defenders could not afford. One by one, the defensive positions began to fall silent. Alexander Lee was hit in the chest, the bullet spinning him around and sending him crashing to the floor. Diane Parker immediately went to his aid, her hands steady as she tried to stop the bleeding. "We cannot hold them much longer," Edward called out over the sound of gunfire. "They are too many, and we are running out of ammunition." Amy could see the truth in his words, could feel the tide of battle turning against them despite their courage and determination. But she also knew that surrender was not an option. Myers had not come to take prisoners. A new sound cut through the chaos of battle, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats that seemed to come from all directions at once. Amy felt her heart leap with hope as she realized what was happening. Reinforcements were arriving, riders emerging from the darkness to strike at Myers' men from behind. She could see muzzle flashes blooming in the hills around the homestead as the new arrivals opened fire on the attackers. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Myers' men, caught between the defenders in the cabin and the new attackers in the hills, found themselves in an impossible position. Several of them broke and ran, abandoning their positions and fleeing into the darkness. Through the chaos, Amy could hear a familiar voice shouting orders to the new arrivals. It was Aaron Brooks, leading what sounded like a substantial force of ranchers and farmers who had come to join the fight. The tide of battle turned with startling speed. Myers' hired guns, faced with determined resistance from multiple directions, began to lose their nerve. These were men accustomed to intimidating helpless victims, not fighting against organized opposition. The gunfire began to slacken as more and more of the attackers withdrew, their morale broken by the unexpected arrival of reinforcements. Amy could hear Myers himself shouting frantically at his men, trying to rally them for another assault. But it was too late. Word of the siege had spread throughout the territory, and people who had been too afraid to act before had finally found the courage to stand up to Myers and his tyranny. The coalition that had begun at Devil's Canyon had grown into something larger and more powerful than anyone had imagined. As dawn broke over the battlefield, Amy could see the extent of their victory. Myers' force had been scattered and demoralized, with many of his hired guns fleeing the territory rather than face continued resistance. The man himself was nowhere to be seen, apparently having retreated with the remnants of his army. The homestead had survived, though not without cost. Alexander Lee was seriously wounded but alive, and several other defenders had been injured in the fighting. But they had held their ground, had proven that ordinary people could stand up to tyranny and emerge victorious. Edward found Amy as she emerged from the cabin, his face showing exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "We did it," he said simply. "We actually did it." Amy looked around at the scene of their victory, at the men and women who had risked everything to defend their homes and their freedom. "Yes," she said quietly, "we did." But even as she spoke the words, Amy knew that their victory was about more than just defeating Myers and his hired guns. They had proven something important about themselves and their community, had shown that courage and determination could triumph over wealth and intimidation. The frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength and was not afraid to use it in defense of what was right. Amy Cox had found her place in the world at last, and she would never again let fear dictate her choices. Spring came early to the Colorado Territory that year, with the snow melting from the valleys and new grass beginning to show green on the hillsides. Amy stood on the porch of their rebuilt homestead, watching Edward work in the garden they had planted together, his movements strong and sure despite the scars that remained from his wounded arm. The months since the siege had brought profound changes to the territory. Brandon Myers had disappeared entirely, some said fleeing to California with what remained of his wealth, others claiming he had been found dead in a canyon somewhere north of Denver. Either way, his reign of terror was over, and the people of the territory were free to build their lives without fear of his retaliation. The coalition that had formed to oppose Myers had evolved into something more permanent, a territorial council that helped settle disputes and organize mutual defense against the various dangers of frontier life. Amy served as secretary for the group, her experience with correspondence and record-keeping making her invaluable to their efforts. Alexander Lee had recovered from his wounds, though he walked with a slight limp that would probably never fully heal. He had been elected president of the Territorial Council, his natural leadership and military experience making him the obvious choice for the position. Jessica Thomas had expanded her ranch significantly, buying up land that Myers had been forced to abandon when his financial empire collapsed. She was now one of the most successful ranchers in the territory, her success proving that determination and hard work could triumph over any obstacle. Amy heard the sound of approaching horses and looked up to see Aaron Brooks riding into their yard, his face bright with excitement. Behind him came several other riders, including a man in a dark suit who looked distinctly out of place in the mountain setting. Edward emerged from the garden, wiping his hands on a cloth as he approached the visitors. "What brings you out here, Aaron?" he asked with a smile. "Good news," Brooks replied, dismounting and gesturing toward the man in the suit. "This is Thomas Richardson, a reporter from the Denver newspaper. He wants to write a story about what happened here, about how ordinary people stood up to Myers and his hired guns." Amy felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of being interviewed by a newspaper reporter. She had grown comfortable with her role in the community, but the idea of having her story told to the wider world was somewhat intimidating. Richardson approached with the confident manner of a man accustomed to getting the information he wanted. "Mrs. Cox," he said, extending his hand in greeting, "I have heard remarkable things about your role in the resistance to Brandon Myers. Would you be willing to speak with me about your experiences?" Amy glanced at Edward, who nodded encouragement. She had come to trust her own judgment in the months since the siege, had learned that her voice and her story had value beyond her own understanding. "I would be happy to speak with you," she said, gesturing toward the chairs on the porch. "But I should warn you that I am not the hero of this story. That honor belongs to all the people who risked their lives to stand up for what was right." Richardson smiled at her modesty, but Amy could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes. He was clearly a man who knew a good story when he heard one, and the tale of the mail-order bride who had helped defeat a territorial tyrant was exactly the kind of human interest piece that would capture readers' attention. They spent the afternoon talking, with Amy recounting her journey from Chicago and the events that had led to the final confrontation with Myers. Richardson took careful notes, occasionally asking questions that helped clarify details or explore the emotional impact of her experiences. What struck Amy most about the interview was how far she had come from the frightened woman who had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge. The story she told was one of transformation and growth, of discovering inner strength she had never known she possessed. When Richardson finally finished his questions, he looked up from his notebook with obvious admiration. "Mrs. Cox," he said, "your story is exactly what people need to hear right now. In a time when so many feel powerless against forces beyond their control, you have shown that ordinary individuals can make a difference." Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks at the praise, but she also felt the truth of his words. Her story was not unique in its basic elements, but it was powerful in its demonstration that people could change, could grow beyond their circumstances, and find the courage to fight for what they believed in. After Richardson and the others had left, Amy found herself sitting on the porch with Edward as the sun set behind the western peaks. The mountains looked different now than they had when she first arrived, less threatening and more welcoming, as if they had finally accepted her as one of their own. "Do you ever regret it?" Edward asked quietly. "Coming west, getting involved in all this trouble?" Amy considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman she had been and the life she had left behind in Chicago. Never, she said finally. This is where I was meant to be, with you and these people in this place. Edward reached over and took her hand, his touch warm and familiar after months of marriage. I love you, Amy Cox, he said simply. Amy squeezed his hand in return, feeling the contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. I love you too, she replied. As darkness fell over the valley, Amy could see lights beginning to appear in the windows of distant homesteads, each one representing the family that was free to pursue their dreams without fear of men like Myers. It was a sight that filled her with quiet satisfaction, the knowledge that their struggle had made a real difference in people's lives. The story that Richardson would write would reach readers throughout the territory and beyond, carrying the message that tyranny could be defeated by ordinary people who found the courage to stand together. It was a lesson that Amy had learned through hard experience, and one that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. 6 months later, Amy stood in the same spot on the porch, but this time her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child was growing. The baby was due in the fall, and Amy found herself looking forward to the future with excitement rather than fear. Edward had built an addition to the cabin to accommodate their growing family, his skilled hands creating a nursery that would welcome their child into a world that was safer and more hopeful than the one Amy had known when she first arrived. The Territorial Council had grown into a formal government, with representatives from throughout the region working together to build schools, roads, and other infrastructure that would help the territory prosper. Amy continued to serve as secretary, her organizational skills and clear writing making her an invaluable part of the democratic process. Richardson's article had been published in newspapers throughout the West, bringing new settlers to the territory who were drawn by the story of a place where ordinary people could build extraordinary lives. The population was growing steadily, with new homesteads appearing in valleys that had been empty just a year before. Amy often thought about her sister Margaret, wondering what she would have made of the life that Amy had built using her identity. She liked to think that Margaret would have been proud, that she would have approved of the way her letters had ultimately led to something beautiful and meaningful. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Cedar Ridge carrying a lie had become a pillar of the community, a woman whose courage and determination had helped shape the future of an entire territory. It was a transformation that still amazed Amy when she thought about it, the knowledge that people could change so completely when circumstances demanded it. As she watched Edward working in their expanded garden, Amy felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place. She had left Chicago running from a life she could not bear, but she had found something far better than she had ever dared to hope for. The mountains stood eternal around their valley, silent witnesses to the courage of those who dared to build lives in their shadow. And in that silence, Amy Cox prepared to welcome the next generation of pioneers, children who would grow up free and strong in the land their parents had fought to protect. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and promise. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Amy knew that she and Edward would face them together, united by love and strengthened by the knowledge that they had already overcome more than most people faced in a lifetime. She was no longer running from anything. She was running toward everything she had ever wanted, and she had finally learned to believe that she deserved the happiness she had found. The story of the fat mail-order bride who was rejected at the station had become the story of a woman who discovered her own worth and fought to defend it. And in the end, that was the only story that truly mattered.